Hey guys, tonight we're going back to the 1st century before the Common Era into the final chapter of ancient Egypt's independent rule. This is the world of Cleopatra, a woman whose life was filled with politics, family rivalries, and unexpected survival in a world already dominated by Rome. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you just woke up in the year 69 BCE in Alexandria, Egypt. The Mediterranean sun is just beginning to rise, spilling its light across a city unlike any other. Alexandria is still a fairly new creation by the standards of Egypt's ancient history, only about 3 centuries old at this point. Yet it is already the beating heart of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Founded by Alexander the Great, the city was built as a showcase of Greek order upon Egyptian soil. Wide boulevards stretch out in deliberate grids, marble palaces stand above the sea, and the towering pharaoh's lighthouse still glimmers as one of the wonders of the world. But beneath that outward grandeur lies a city with tensions. The ruling dynasty, the Ptolemies, are Macedonian Greeks who have sat on the throne of Egypt since Alexander's conquest. For centuries they have tried to rule as pharaohs, dressing in Egyptian garb during ceremonies, building temples for the gods of the Nile, and paying lip service to ancient traditions. Yet everyone knows they are foreign. Their Greek court customs, their language, and their endless infighting have kept them apart from the Egyptian people they rule. Into this world Cleopatra was born, the daughter of Ptolemy XN, often remembered by his mocking nickname, Elites, which means the flute player. Her father was not a great warrior or a stern administrator. He was remembered for his love of music, his indulgences, and his shaky grip on power. By the time Cleopatra came into the world, the Ptolemaic dynasty was already crumbling under the weight of corruption, Roman pressure, and family betrayals. As a child, Cleopatra would have grown up in the royal palace district of Alexandria, a complex that sprawled across the eastern harbor. Imagine long colonnades, shaded gardens, fountains where water splashed quietly, and courtyards lined with imported Greek statues. The palace overlooked the Mediterranean Sea, which must have seemed endless to a young girl staring out at the horizon. Ships constantly arrived in the harbors, grain ships, merchant vessels from Cyprus, envoys from Rome. Alexandria was not just a capital, it was the hinge between continents, a place where Africa, Asia, and Europe touched. From the very beginning, Cleopatra was taught languages, philosophy, and the rituals of power. Unlike many of her relatives, she became fluent in Egyptian as well as Greek. This may sound like a small thing, but it was extraordinary. Most of the Ptolemaic kings and queens spoke only Greek and considered Egyptian a tongue for commoners. Cleopatra broke with this tradition. She spoke to priests, administrators, and ordinary people in their own language, and this skill would later give her a bond with her subjects that her ancestors lacked. Her education also included the sciences. Alexandria was home to the famous library and the museum, which served as a kind of ancient research center. While much of that library's content is now lost to us, in Cleopatra's youth it still held the accumulated wisdom of centuries, scrolls on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, geography, and philosophy. Whether she ever read these texts directly, or had them distilled through her tutors, is unclear. But the environment of Alexandria meant she was surrounded by the spirit of inquiry and scholarship. She would later be remembered not just as a queen, but as a thinker, someone who could match wits with the best minds of her time. And yet, childhood for Cleopatra was not entirely serene. Her family was notorious for deadly rivalries. Brothers and sisters often became rivals for the throne, and assassination was not unusual in the Ptolemaic court. Children were raised with the understanding that any one of them could become a pawn, or worse, an obstacle to be removed. For Cleopatra, survival meant learning how to read people, their motives, their moods, their weaknesses. She grew up in a palace where a smile could mask a dagger and where loyalty was fragile. Her father, Ptolemy X's son, struggled with Rome. At this time, Egypt's wealth made it both desirable and vulnerable. The grain from the Nile fed much of the Mediterranean, and whoever controlled Egypt could wield enormous influence. But Egypt was militarily weak compared to Rome. To keep his throne, Ptolemy Xu paid vast sums of money to Roman politicians. He taxed his subjects heavily, which made him deeply unpopular at home, but it bought him temporary safety abroad. Cleopatra, as his daughter, would have watched this balancing act, her father flattering Roman envoys, sending treasure after treasure across the sea, and still never quite securing his throne. The young Cleopatra likely absorbed the lesson that diplomacy mattered more than raw power. Egypt could no longer fight its way to independence. It had to survive by choosing allies carefully, by charming, persuading, and maneuvering. These were skills she would later perfect, but their seeds were planted in her youth. We do not know much about her earliest years in detail. Our sources are fragmentary, scattered through Roman historians who often wrote with bias. Yet even these fragments show a girl of unusual talents. Ancient writers later remarked that she was not the most beautiful woman of her age, but she had a force of presence, a charisma, and above all a mind that drew people to her. This reputation must have started early, when she was still a child learning in the palace halls, listening carefully, watching her family, and slowly realizing the fragility of her kingdom. Think for a moment about the contrast of her world. Outside her palace walls, the Egyptian countryside stretched in timeless rhythms. Farmers still worked the land as they had for thousands of years, sowing grain, tending cattle, and following the annual rise of the Nile. Inside the palace, however, Greek philosophers debated logic, court officials schemed for influence, and foreign envoys whispered of Rome's growing dominance. Cleopatra was a child at the intersection of these worlds, the eternal Nile, the restless politics of Greece, and the looming shadow of Rome. By the time she reached adolescence, Cleopatra had already seen her father exiled and restored, her family torn by conflict, and her people resentful of foreign rulers. She must have known, even then, that her path would not be ordinary. She was not just one child among many, she was being shaped into someone who might one day hold the fate of Egypt in her hands. And so, in these early years, we see the foundation of Cleopatra's story. A girl born into splendor yet raised in uncertainty, educated in the arts of language and diplomacy, walking the marbled halls of Alexandria's palace, while listening to the whispers of Rome's approach. What must it have felt like to grow up in a city that was both the pride of the ancient world and a fragile bubble about to burst under Roman pressure? Did Cleopatra, as a child, sense the weight of history gathering around her? Or did she simply look out at the harbor, watching the sails of foreign ships, wondering which of them would change her life forever? When we left off, Cleopatra was still a young girl, surrounded by the grandeur and uncertainty of Alexandria. She had inherited both privilege and peril, the finest education in the Mediterranean, but also a family lineage notorious for bloodshed and intrigue. Now let's step deeper into her adolescence and the political stage she was being prepared to enter. By the time Cleopatra was in her early teens, her father, Ptolemy X's, had lost his throne. The cause was not surprising. Years of heavy taxation to pay Roman bribes had left Egypt simmering with discontent. The Alexandrian elite, who prided themselves on Greek culture and civic life, despised his weakness. When Rome itself became divided, with rival factions competing for influence, Ptolemy X's careful balancing act collapsed. He was driven into exile, and for a brief period, Cleopatra lived in a kingdom that was no longer ruled by her father. This would have been a critical moment in shaping her sense of power and vulnerability. Imagine being a girl of 13 or 14, seeing your father, the pharaoh, forced to flee across the sea, while strangers filled his place in the palace halls. The security of her world was revealed as an illusion. For several years, Cleopatra likely remained in Egypt under the watchful eyes of her older sisters and other royal relatives. During this time, her older sister, Berenice IV, claimed power. Berenice presented herself as queen, even arranging her own marriage alliances to strengthen her legitimacy. But her reign was doomed from the start, because Ptolemy Xtar had not disappeared forever. Through careful pleading, bribery, and alliance building, Ptolemy secured the backing of Rome to return. It was not loyalty from his people that brought him home, but the steel of Roman legions. In 55 BCE, supported by a Roman general named Aulus Gabinius, Ptolemy was restored to the throne. His return was brutal. Berenice was executed, along with many of her supporters. For Cleopatra, this would have been a chilling reminder of how thin the line was between family and enemy. She had survived because she was still young, still useful, and perhaps still seen as pliable. But survival in the Ptolemaic house was always provisional. Children grew into rivals quickly. During these years of turmoil, Cleopatra honed her political instincts. She observed that the throne of Egypt was no longer a matter of Egyptian will. It depended on Rome. Whoever could win Rome's favor, through gold, through charm, or through calculation, would rule. The gods of the Nile still mattered in ritual. The priesthood still carried prestige, but the true arbiters of power were across the Mediterranean. This realization helps explain why Cleopatra later became so skilled at aligning herself with Roman leaders. She was not simply seducing powerful men, as later propaganda suggested. She was enacting a survival strategy that she had absorbed since childhood. Egypt was too weak to stand alone. Its ruler had to make Egypt useful to Rome, while somehow preserving Egyptian dignity and autonomy. Let us pause for a moment on Alexandria itself during Cleopatra's adolescence. The city was a mosaic of cultures. Greek colonists filled the upper classes, Egyptian farmers and laborers formed the majority, and foreigners from every port crowded its harbors. Jews had a significant community there, Syrians brought their traditions, and merchants from as far as India and Nubia could be found in the markets. The city's rhythm was noisy, restless, and cosmopolitan. Chariots rattled through stone streets, vendors called out in multiple languages, and scholars argued in shaded porticos near the library. For Cleopatra, growing up in such a place meant that her mind was stretched far beyond the confines of Egypt itself. She was aware of distant lands, of global trade routes, and of the way ideas traveled as swiftly as ships. Her tutors likely guided her through Homer's epics, through works of philosophy, through the science of medicine and astronomy. But her greatest gift was her ability to turn knowledge into persuasion. Ancient sources suggest she had a voice that captivated, and a way of speaking that made others forget her flaws. This was not a lesson from books. It was a skill forged in the palace, where every word might carry consequence. As her father grew older, Cleopatra's role in court became more pronounced. By the time she was in her late teens, she was not only a princess but also a participant in state ceremonies. She joined her father in processions, offered sacrifices to Egyptian gods, and presented herself as a bridge between Greek rulers and Egyptian subjects. Unlike her siblings, she cultivated an Egyptian identity alongside her Greek one. This was a shrewd choice, one that made her stand out in the dynasty. When Ptolemy Xti died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was about 18 years old. She had been shaped by years of instability, educated in both Greek and Egyptian traditions, and sharpened by the knowledge that survival depended on quick wit and flexibility. Her father's will declared that she should rule jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy Xi, who was only about 10 years old. On paper, this seemed a balance of power within the family. In reality, it was the beginning of another struggle. Cleopatra, still so young, now found herself thrust into the position of co-ruler of Egypt. And yet, what did it mean to be a young woman suddenly expected to wield power in a kingdom where generals, priests, and foreign envoys all held competing interests? How could Cleopatra transform her careful observations of childhood into action as queen? When we last left Cleopatra, she was 18 years old, suddenly elevated from princess to co-ruler of Egypt alongside her much younger brother, Ptolemy XT. It was 51 BCE, and the fate of her kingdom hung in the balance. The will of Ptolemy XT had been carefully worded. Cleopatra and Ptolemy XT were meant to rule jointly. But in practice, such arrangements rarely worked smoothly. Cleopatra, though young, was intelligent, ambitious, and already accustomed to the responsibilities of court life. Her brother, by contrast, was still a child, controlled by advisors and guardians who saw in him an opportunity to wield power for themselves. Almost immediately, tensions began to rise. Cleopatra sought to rule in her own right, her face appearing alone on official documents, and coins minted in her name showed her features rather than her brother's. This was bold, even provocative. It sent a clear signal. She did not intend to be merely a ceremonial figure standing alongside her younger sibling. She intended to rule. But in a palace like Alexandria's, boldness invited resistance. Ptolemy XI's guardians, most notably the influential regent Pothinus, began to push back. They sought to sideline Cleopatra, to make her power symbolic, while real decisions were handled by men behind her brother's throne. This was not unusual. Women had ruled Egypt before, but never without scrutiny, and the Greek traditions of the Ptolemies still regarded female power with suspicion. For Cleopatra, the struggle quickly became one of survival. In public ceremonies, she still appeared as the dutiful sister and co-ruler. But behind the scenes, alliances shifted. Factions formed around her and around her brother. The court, already notorious for intrigue, became a nest of competing interests, each trying to anticipate which sibling would triumph. At the same time, the world outside Egypt's borders was changing rapidly. Rome, the great shadow over Egyptian politics, was entering its most turbulent years. The first triumvirate, the uneasy alliance between Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Crassus, was unraveling. Crassus had been killed in Parthia, and Caesar and Pompey were inching closer to open conflict. Rome's civil war was on the horizon, and whichever Roman leader emerged victorious would inevitably shape Egypt's future. Cleopatra understood this. She knew Egypt's wealth and grain supply made it valuable to both sides. She also knew that survival meant making herself indispensable, not expendable. Already, she was practicing the diplomacy that would later define her career, positioning Egypt as useful, even while preserving her own authority. Still, the situation inside Egypt grew more dangerous. By 49 BCE, just 2 years into her reign, Cleopatra found herself driven out of Alexandria. The faction around her brother Ptolemy XIII, backed by powerful courtiers, forced her to flee. She retreated into the eastern deserts, gathering what forces she could. Imagine this scene: Cleopatra, still barely 20 years old, no longer walking the marble colonnades of Alexandria, but instead moving through dusty encampments in the Nile Delta, surrounded by loyal retainers and mercenaries. She was in exile, but not defeated. She understood that to reclaim her throne, she needed more than soldiers. She needed the right ally. That ally would arrive in the form of Rome's civil war. In 48 BCE, Pompey the Great, having been defeated by Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus, fled to Egypt, seeking refuge with the boy, King Ptolemy XT. What followed was one of the most infamous episodes in Egyptian history. Pompey was treacherously murdered upon his arrival, his head presented to Caesar when he, too, arrived in Alexandria shortly after. This moment would change everything for Cleopatra. Julius Caesar was now in Egypt, and the young queen saw her chance. If she could win Caesar's support, she might not only regain her throne, but also secure her dynasty's survival. But that is where we must pause for now. So here we leave Cleopatra at the edge of transformation. No longer just a girl raised in the palace halls of Alexandria, no longer simply a co-ruler with her brother, but a queen in exile, preparing for the boldest gamble of her life. Would Caesar see in her a partner, an ally, perhaps even something more? Or would she be swept aside, another casualty of Rome's relentless expansion? It was 48 BCE, and Alexandria was caught between two storms. The internal struggle between Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy Sekfi had already fractured Egypt, while the great Roman civil war between Caesar and Pompey had spilled into the eastern Mediterranean. The city that once prided itself on being the cultural jewel of the Hellenistic world was now a chessboard in the hands of greater powers. The murder of Pompey marked a turning point. Ptolemy XD's advisors believed they had chosen wisely by eliminating Pompey and presenting his severed head to Julius Caesar. They thought Caesar would be grateful that by removing his rival they had earned his trust. But Caesar was not pleased. He was horrified by the dishonor done to a Roman consul, even one who had been his enemy. The Alexandrian court had miscalculated. Instead of gratitude, they faced a Roman general both insulted and suspicious. Cleopatra, still exiled from Alexandria and gathering her supporters in the countryside, saw the danger and the opportunity. She understood Caesar's power better than her brother's advisors did. She knew that winning Caesar's favor could mean the difference between restoration and permanent defeat. But how could she reach him? Alexandria was in the hands of Ptolemy's faction, the palace guarded, the city hostile to her presence. The story that survives is one of the most famous in antiquity, and though ancient writers added their own embellishments, the core of it is revealing. Cleopatra arranged to be smuggled into Caesar's presence, bypassing her brother's guards. Plutarch tells us she was carried in a rug, or perhaps, as others said, in a linen sack, rolled up and presented as a gift. When the fabric was unrolled before Caesar, out stepped the exiled queen herself. The details may be theatrical, but the meaning is clear. Cleopatra risked everything on a bold gesture, a direct appeal to Caesar himself. She would not wait for formal negotiations, nor rely on letters or envoys. She placed her life in Caesar's hands, presenting herself as both vulnerable and daring. For Caesar, who was 52 at the time, weary from years of civil war, and suddenly thrust into the politics of Egypt, this must have been an unforgettable scene. Here was a young woman of about 21, educated, eloquent, and radiating the confidence of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Ancient sources remark not only on her appearance but on her presence. Her ability to make her voice, her wit, and her intelligence the center of attention. Their meeting was more than personal chemistry, it was a negotiation of survival. Cleopatra needed Caesar's backing to reclaim her throne from her brother. Caesar needed Egypt stable, its grain secure, and its ruler indebted to him. A partnership, however unlikely it seemed, made sense for both. As Caesar lingered in Alexandria, tensions in the city deepened. Ptolemy II and his advisors saw Cleopatra's sudden closeness with Caesar as a threat to their own authority. The situation spiraled into open conflict. This became known as the Alexandrian War, a chaotic clash that turned the great city into a battlefield. Cleopatra maneuvered carefully through this storm. She appeared alongside Caesar in the palace, asserting her role as co-ruler, even as fighting broke out across Alexandria's harbors and streets. For the people of the city, it must have been a bewildering spectacle. Roman legions marching through colonnades, Egyptian factions battling one another, fires breaking out near the docks, and rumors spreading of betrayal at every corner. The most dramatic moment of the Alexandrian War came when Caesar himself was nearly trapped in the city. Ptolemy's forces controlled much of Alexandria, while Caesar and his men were confined to the palace quarter and the harbor. Supplies ran low, and Caesar was forced into desperate measures to hold his position. At one point, he even ordered parts of the great library's annex burned to clear lines of defense, an act that later legends exaggerated into the destruction of the entire library of Alexandria. Cleopatra stayed close to Caesar during this time, not as a passive figure, but as an active participant in shaping her destiny. She provided intelligence, rallied her supporters, and used her knowledge of Egyptian politics to strengthen Caesar's hand. The image of her as a woman entirely dependent on Caesar's favor is misleading. What she offered was not just beauty, but legitimacy. Caesar, as a foreigner, needed her as much as she needed him. Eventually, reinforcements arrived. Roman legions loyal to Caesar entered Egypt, and the tide turned. Ptolemy XI attempted to flee across the Nile, but drowned in the attempt. His death removed Cleopatra's most immediate rival. By 47 BCE, Cleopatra was restored to the throne, not alone but alongside another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, as co-ruler. In reality, she held the true power, while her brother was little more than a ceremonial partner. She had secured her position, but she had also tied Egypt's fate firmly to Caesar. The alliance was cemented in more ways than politics. Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers, and soon Cleopatra bore him a son, Ptolemy XV, known to history as Caesarion, Little Caesar. For Cleopatra, this was both personal and profoundly political. The birth of Caesarion gave her dynasty a living link to Rome's most powerful man, a child who might one day claim legitimacy in both worlds. Yet the question lingered, had Cleopatra truly secured Egypt's independence, or had she simply exchanged one form of dependency for another? With Caesar's protection, she sat firmly on her throne. But what would happen if that protection vanished? With the Alexandrian War behind her and her brother Ptolemy XI dead, Cleopatra emerged stronger than before. At just 22 years old, she had reclaimed her throne with the backing of Rome's most formidable general. Yet her position was still precarious. Egypt remained dependent on Caesar's favor, and her own dynasty was notorious for its tendency toward betrayal. To strengthen her rule, Cleopatra officially shared the throne with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. In reality, he was a child, a ceremonial co-ruler whose name satisfied dynastic tradition, but whose influence was negligible. The true power now lay firmly with Cleopatra, though she exercised it with care, balancing Egyptian customs, Greek traditions, and Roman expectations. In the months following the Alexandrian War, Cleopatra and Caesar remained together in Egypt. Their partnership went beyond politics. Ancient writers describe Cleopatra's ability to charm not just through her appearance, but through conversation, intellect, and wit. Caesar, though more than 30 years her senior, found in her a companion as well as an ally. One of the most legendary episodes of this period was their voyage up the Nile. With the war settled, Cleopatra invited Caesar to see the ancient heart of her country. They sailed in a royal barge along the river, surrounded by attendants, musicians, and soldiers. The boat itself was said to be magnificent, its sails dyed purple, its oars flashing in rhythm to music, the deck adorned with golden decorations. This journey was more than a display of luxury. For Cleopatra, it was a demonstration of legitimacy. She showed Caesar the temples, the monuments, the fertile fields, all the symbols of a kingdom with traditions older than Rome itself. She was not merely a client queen begging for Roman protection. She was presenting herself as the living embodiment of pharaonic Egypt. Caesar, for his part, seemed fascinated. For a man who had conquered Gaul and marched on Rome, Egypt offered a spectacle of antiquity and grandeur that dwarfed anything in Europe. The voyage also served to strengthen Cleopatra's standing among her own people. To appear on the Nile with Caesar at her side was to send a message. Egypt's queen was recognized and supported by the strongest man in the Roman world. Any lingering doubts about her rule, any whispers that she was vulnerable, in 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy XV, but the world would come to know him as Caesarion, Little Caesar. His very name was a declaration of his father's identity. For Cleopatra, Caesarion was a guarantee of her dynasty's survival. If Rome accepted him as Caesar's son, then Egypt's throne could be secured not just by alliance but by blood. But Rome was less accommodating. Caesar himself never publicly acknowledged Caesarion as his heir, though Cleopatra made no secret of the child's parentage. In Rome, politics were delicate. Caesar already had an adopted heir in Gaius Octavius, later Augustus, who would inherit his legacy. A foreign-born child, and especially one born to an Egyptian queen, was unlikely to be embraced by Rome's elite. Still, for Cleopatra, Caesarion was her strongest card. She now had a son who linked her directly to Rome's future, and she would spend the rest of her life defending his claim. Caesar remained in Egypt for several months after the Alexandrian War, longer than many in Rome thought wise. His enemies accused him of being seduced, distracted, or ensnared by Cleopatra's charms. Pamphlets circulated suggesting that he had abandoned Roman discipline for Egyptian luxury, spending his days feasting on Cleopatra's barge while Rome waited for his return. Yet Caesar's reasons were practical as well as personal. Egypt's grain was vital to Rome, and its stability was essential for his larger ambitions. By supporting Cleopatra, he ensured Egypt would be loyal to him, not to his enemies. When Caesar finally departed for Rome, Cleopatra's situation once again became delicate. Without Caesar physically present, her authority was vulnerable to challenge. She remained on the throne with Ptolemy XIV as her nominal co-ruler, and now with Caesarion as her heir. But her survival was tethered to Caesar's victories in Rome. If Caesar fell, Cleopatra's throne would almost certainly fall with him. Back in Rome, Caesar's opponents used his relationship with Cleopatra as political ammunition. They mocked him for keeping a foreign queen as a mistress, and they cast Cleopatra as a dangerous influence. Roman society was both fascinated and repelled by her. To many senators, she embodied the fear that luxury, decadence, and foreign customs were corrupting Rome's traditional values. For Cleopatra, however, the connection with Caesar was invaluable. She visited Rome at least once, likely in 46 BCE, accompanied by Caesarion. She stayed in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, where her presence stirred both curiosity and hostility. To ordinary Romans, she was a spectacle, the living queen of Egypt, adorned in exotic dress, her reputation preceding her. To the Senate, her presence was unsettling. She was a reminder that Caesar was not simply Rome's leader, but a man willing to associate openly with foreign monarchs. In these years, Cleopatra balanced carefully between worlds. In Egypt, she ruled as pharaoh, invoking the gods, commissioning temples, and presenting herself as the daughter of Isis. In Rome, she appeared as a client monarch, dependent on Caesar's favor yet confident enough to walk in the halls of power. But beneath this balancing act lay uncertainty. What if Caesar were assassinated? What if another Roman general rose to power and saw her as an obstacle rather than an ally? Her position, though strong, was always precarious. The Nile voyage, the birth of Caesarion, and her visit to Rome all reinforced her image as both queen and survivor. Yet history was moving swiftly, and storms were gathering in Rome that would shake Cleopatra's world once again. By 46 BCE, Cleopatra had secured her throne, born Caesar's son, and even appeared in Rome as a visible reminder of the partnership between Egypt and the most powerful Roman alive. Yet the foundations of her security were fragile. Egypt's independence now leaned entirely on Caesar's favor, and Caesar himself was walking a dangerous path. Cleopatra's visit to Rome caused a stir. She did not lodge in the city center, but stayed in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, a deliberate distance from the heart of the Republic. Still, her presence was impossible to ignore. Senators passed her residence on their way to the Forum, and whispers spread quickly. Caesar was keeping a foreign queen under his roof. For the Roman elite, this was scandalous. Roman tradition prided itself on the rejection of monarchy. Since the expulsion of their kings centuries earlier, the very idea of a ruler crowned as sovereign was seen as a threat to liberty. Cleopatra, however, embodied monarchy. She was the pharaoh of Egypt, styled as the daughter of Isis, accustomed to being worshipped as a living goddess. To many Romans, her closeness to Caesar seemed like proof that he sought to crown himself king. This fear was amplified in 46 BCE, when Caesar celebrated his triumphs in Rome. Cleopatra was in attendance, and Caesarion's existence was an open secret. Some Romans suspected that Caesar might name the boy his heir, replacing Octavius, his adopted relative. The thought of a foreign child, born of a queen from the east, inheriting Rome was intolerable to the Senate. Cleopatra, meanwhile, played her role carefully. She did not overstep, nor did she challenge Rome's authority. Her strategy was to remain indispensable, presenting herself as the ruler who could keep Egypt stable and loyal. Still, she must have sensed the hostility around her, the way her presence was twisting Roman politics into sharper conflict. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra continued her duties as queen. She maintained temples, appointed officials, and ensured the Nile's wealth was harvested and exported. Her reign, though shaped by alliances with Rome, was also firmly rooted in Egyptian tradition. She appeared in reliefs wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, presenting offerings to the gods and depicting herself as the reincarnation of Isis. To her subjects, she was not simply Caesar's consort. She was pharaoh, part of an unbroken line stretching back to the time of the pyramids. But her image in Rome was far different. Roman satirists mocked her as a temptress, a symbol of the luxury and decadence that threatened to soften Roman virtue. Caesar himself was accused of being enslaved by her beauty, distracted from his duties, and seduced into adopting Eastern habits. These accusations said more about Roman anxieties than about Cleopatra, yet they reveal how precarious her influence was. The decisive blow came on the Ides of March 44 BCE. Julius Caesar, at the height of his power, was assassinated in the Senate by conspirators who feared he aimed to make himself king. Cleopatra was in Rome at the time, or at least close enough to feel the shock immediately. The man who had secured her throne, who had fathered her son, who had been her ally against all rivals, was suddenly gone. For Cleopatra, the news must have been devastating. In an instant, her greatest protector vanished. Worse still, Caesar's death unleashed chaos in Rome. His assassins claimed they were restoring the Republic, but instead they plunged the city into further civil war. Cleopatra had no guarantee that Caesar's allies would support her or her son. In fact, Caesarion's very existence made him a potential threat to Caesar's Roman heirs. She made the only choice possible. She returned to Egypt. With Caesar gone, Rome was no longer safe, and her position in the city was untenable. Back in Alexandria, she declared her son Caesarion as her co-ruler, styling him as Ptolemy XV. By placing him on the throne beside her, she emphasized his legitimacy, not only as the son of an Egyptian queen, but as the child of Julius Caesar. This was a gamble. In Egypt, Caesarion's role strengthened her dynasty. In Rome, however, it was provocative. Caesar's official heir was Octavius, his adopted son. For Octavius and for Caesar's other allies, Caesarion represented an awkward challenge, a rival claim that could one day destabilize Rome. Cleopatra surely understood this, but she also knew that without Caesarion's claim, her dynasty's future would be far weaker. Thus Cleopatra's years with Caesar ended with both triumph and uncertainty. She had regained her throne, secured Egypt's independence for the moment, and given birth to an heir who bound her dynasty to Rome's legacy. Yet with Caesar's assassination, the fragile balance shattered. Now she faced a new reality. Rome would descend into civil war, again, this time between Caesar's heir Octavius and his loyal general Mark Antony on one side, and the assassins on the other. Cleopatra, as always, would have to choose carefully to place her kingdom's survival on the strongest side of Rome's endless struggles. But which Roman leader would she trust? And how could she, a queen of Egypt, avoid becoming nothing more than a pawn in Rome's battles? In the years following Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the ancient world seemed suspended in uncertainty. The Roman Republic, already battered by decades of civil war, was thrown into yet another cycle of violence, betrayal, and shifting allegiances. Cleopatra, now firmly established as Queen of Egypt with her young son Caesarion as co-ruler, watched carefully from Alexandria as Rome descended into chaos once more. She had already tied her fate to one Roman titan. Now, she would have to decide how, and with whom, to navigate the storm that followed Caesar's death. At the center of this new conflict stood three men who claimed Caesar's legacy. First, there was Marcus Junius Brutus, one of the assassins, who argued that the killing had preserved liberty and saved Rome from monarchy. Then there was Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and legal heir, a young man of just 19, but ambitious and relentless. Finally, there was Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted general, who styled himself as the true executor of Caesar's will and memory. The alliances shifted rapidly. Octavian and Antony, though rivals, found common cause against Caesar's murderers. With Lepidus, another of Caesar's officers, they formed the so-called Second Triumvirate, a three-man dictatorship over Rome. Their first task was vengeance. In 42 BCE, at the Battle of Philippi in Greece, Brutus and Cassius, leaders of Caesar's assassins, were crushed. The Republic's dream of restoring old freedoms was gone. Rome was firmly under the rule of Caesar's successors. For Cleopatra, the outcome at Philippi was decisive. She had withheld direct aid from either side, biding her time, but now Egypt could no longer remain neutral. The victors, Antony and Octavian, would divide Rome's empire between them. Antony took control of the eastern provinces, placing him in command of the very regions that bordered Egypt. Octavian, meanwhile, remained in Italy. For Cleopatra, this meant her kingdom's immediate fate rested in Antony's hands. Mark Antony was a very different man from Caesar. Where Caesar had been calculated, measured, and keenly aware of his image, Antony was larger than life, boisterous, indulgent, charismatic, and deeply loyal to his soldiers. He had fought alongside Caesar through thick and thin, earning the devotion of Rome's legions. To many, he represented the raw spirit of the Roman army, brave, coarse, but irresistible in battle. Yet Antony also had weaknesses. His reputation for excess was legendary. He drank heavily, surrounded himself with entertainers, and allowed himself to be swayed by passion more than reason. His political instincts were often erratic, but his personal magnetism made up for it. For Cleopatra, this combination was both dangerous and useful. Antony was a man who could be charmed, who could be persuaded to see Egypt not merely as a vassal state, but as an equal partner. Their first meeting is one of history's most famous scenes, wrapped in both fact and legend. In 41 BCE, Antony summoned Cleopatra to the city of Tarsus in Asia Minor. The purpose, at least officially, was to demand her loyalty and secure her support for his campaigns. Many rulers of the eastern provinces had been called to account before him, and Cleopatra was expected to justify her actions during the civil wars. But Cleopatra did not appear before Antony as a supplicant. Instead, she staged one of the most dramatic entrances in political history. Sailing up the Cydnus River, she arrived on a magnificent barge, its stern gilded, its sails of purple billowing in the wind, and silver oars striking the water in rhythm with music. Cleopatra herself reclined beneath a canopy dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, while attendants fanned her with ostrich feathers and perfumed the air with incense. The spectacle was overwhelming. For Antony, who prided himself on living like a new Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry, Cleopatra's presentation was irresistible. Here was a queen who not only ruled one of the richest kingdoms in the world, but who could embody divine majesty itself. Their meeting in Tarsus marked the beginning of a partnership that would define the next decade of both their lives. What began as politics soon became personal. Cleopatra and Antony returned together to Alexandria, where the queen hosted him in lavish style. Banquets stretched late into the night, with endless wine, elaborate entertainments, and contests of wit and indulgence. Roman writers later accused Cleopatra of corrupting Antony with luxury, but in truth, he hardly needed encouragement. The two of them shared a taste for spectacle, for play, and for a kind of theatrical kingship that blurred the line between mortals and gods. Yet beneath the revelry, there was hard strategy at work. Cleopatra secured Antony's promise to protect her throne and her son Caesarion's claim. In return, she provided financial support and ships for his campaigns in the east. Their partnership was not merely a romance, it was a calculated alliance between Egypt's wealth and Rome's military strength. Still, the personal bond was real. Cleopatra bore Antony twins, a boy and a girl, further entwining their dynasties. For Egypt, this union offered security. For Antony, it offered not just resources, but a vision of kingship far beyond the boundaries of the Republic. Together, they began to imagine a new order in which Rome and Egypt ruled side by side, Antony and Cleopatra as living embodiments of Dionysus and Isis. But even as Antony reveled in Alexandria, trouble brewed in Rome. Octavian, back in Italy, watched with cold precision as Antony grew closer to Cleopatra. He portrayed his rival as a man seduced by a foreign queen, abandoning Roman values in favor of Eastern decadence. In the eyes of Roman citizens, this was damning. For Octavian, every moment Antony spent in Egypt was an opportunity to paint him as unfit to rule. Cleopatra, no stranger to political currents, must have recognized the danger. Yet she also knew that Antony's presence in Egypt was her greatest shield. Without him, her throne would be vulnerable once again to Roman intervention. With him, Egypt was not merely a client state, it was the heart of a grander dream. The question that lingered, however, was this: could Antony truly balance his Roman obligations with his Egyptian ambitions? Or was his fate already sealed the moment he chose Cleopatra's world over Octavian's Rome? The months following Antony's arrival in Alexandria stretched into years. What had begun as a dazzling political courtship transformed into a deep entanglement of power, family, and ambition. To the outside world, Antony was still one of Rome's most powerful men, but within Egypt he was something else entirely. Here, he was not simply a Roman general. He was a king, a god, and Cleopatra's partner in a vision that transcended the dusty laws of the Republic. Cleopatra understood the importance of spectacle better than most rulers of her age. Egypt's monarchy had always blended politics with ritual, weaving together religion, theatre, and authority until the ruler's presence itself became a sacred event. Antony, with his love of revelry and his willingness to play roles larger than life, fitted perfectly into this stage-managed world. The pair formed what ancient writers later called the inimitable livers, a private society devoted to pleasure, feasting, and theatrical games. Night after night, they dined in opulent halls, competed in drinking contests, and staged elaborate pranks. Plutarch, who wrote about Antony more than a century later, claimed that Cleopatra once dressed as a servant to sneak into Antony's quarters in the middle of the night, only to wake him with laughter. On another occasion, Antony went fishing but, frustrated with his poor catches, secretly ordered his men to attach pre-caught fish to his line. Cleopatra, discovering the trick, played along, and then had one of her attendants dive beneath the water and fasten a salted herring to his hook. Antony hauled it up proudly, and the court erupted with laughter at the absurdity of Rome's great general presenting a dead fish as his prize. Beneath the laughter lay something serious. Cleopatra's games were not idle amusement. They reinforced intimacy, trust, and a sense of shared destiny. Antony, accustomed to the rigid hierarchy of Roman politics, found in Alexandria a freedom to indulge and imagine. Cleopatra, meanwhile, solidified her hold over him, not through chains of duty, but through shared delight. Yet Antony could not live forever in Alexandria's embrace. Rome was never far away. In 40 BCE, political crisis pulled him back west. His absence from Cleopatra was long and fraught, and during that time, Cleopatra gave birth to his twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Their very names, Helios for the sun, Selene for the moon, spoke of divine ambitions. They were not merely children, they were celestial heirs in the making, destined, at least in Cleopatra's imagination, to embody the eternal balance of cosmic power. While Antony was away, Octavian moved swiftly to consolidate his influence in Rome. To ease tensions and reassert Roman loyalty, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia. This political marriage brought temporary peace, but it also created a precarious triangle: Octavian and his sister on one side, Cleopatra on the other. The marriage was never more than a truce. Octavia was dignified, loyal, and Roman to the core, qualities that contrasted sharply with Cleopatra's theatrical brilliance. For a while, Antony tried to balance both worlds, but the scales tipped steadily toward Egypt. By 37 BCE, Antony returned to the east. His campaigns demanded money, ships, and provisions, and once again, Cleopatra became indispensable In Antioch, the two were reunited, and Antony openly acknowledged the twins as his children, a rare act for a Roman statesman. From that moment, his bond with Cleopatra was no longer a hidden affair. It was a declaration. The political marriage to Octavia became a formality, while his true partnership lay in Alexandria. Together, Antony and Cleopatra envisioned an empire of their own. Antony sought to conquer Parthia, Rome's great rival in the east, while Cleopatra sought to expand her kingdom's influence and secure dynastic rule for their children. In their minds, they were not merely participants in Rome's politics, they were architects of a new world order. Antony's military ventures, however, did not unfold as planned. His Parthian campaign in 36 BCE was a disaster. Ill prepared for the harsh terrain and harassed by swift Parthian cavalry, his legions suffered immense losses. Cleopatra, ever resourceful, rescued Antony by providing supplies, reinforcements, and financial aid during his retreat. Her role as savior deepened his dependence upon her. To his soldiers, Antony was still a commander. To Cleopatra, he was a partner bound by gratitude and necessity. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra worked to transform defeat into opportunity. She lent Antony not just money but legitimacy. Together, they staged grand ceremonies in which Antony appeared as a new Dionysus, god of fertility and victory, while Cleopatra embodied Isis, mother goddess and queen of heaven. In the ancient world, rulers did not simply govern, they performed their power, and these performances announced to the Mediterranean that their union was not an affair but a divine partnership. The culmination of this vision came in 34 BCE, after Antony's campaign in Armenia. Though not a great triumph, he returned with captives and riches, which he displayed in Alexandria during a spectacle later called the Donations of Alexandria. In a dramatic ceremony, Antony and Cleopatra seated themselves upon golden thrones, dressed as gods, while their children were paraded before the people. Territories were declared under their rule. Caesarion was hailed as the rightful son of Caesar and King of Kings, while Antony and Cleopatra's children were granted kingdoms across the east. For Egypt, it was a breathtaking declaration of power. For Rome, it was provocation. Octavian seized upon the event as proof that Antony had abandoned Roman tradition. No Roman general had ever dared to hold such a triumph outside Rome, let alone dress as a god, while crowning his children as monarchs. To Octavian's allies, this was not strategy but treason, a betrayal of Roman dignity to the hands of a foreign queen. The divide was set. Antony and Cleopatra, seated in golden splendor on the Nile, represented one vision of the future, a fusion of Roman arms and Egyptian majesty, a dynasty of gods and rulers stretching across east and west. Octavian, disciplined and calculating, represented another, the stern restoration of Roman order under his sole control. For now, Antony and Cleopatra revelled in their height of power. Yet even as they staged their ceremonies and named their children rulers of distant lands, the tide was turning. In Rome, Octavian sharpened his rhetoric. He cast Cleopatra as a sorceress, a temptress who had bewitched a great Roman general into betraying his people. Antony, once celebrated as Caesar's right hand, was now portrayed as a puppet of the East. The stage was being set for the greatest conflict of the age, not merely a war between rivals, but a contest between two visions of empire, with Cleopatra and Antony bound together at the center of it. The partnership of Cleopatra and Antony had reached its brightest blaze, but flames that burn brightest often cast the longest shadows. For years, they had delighted in their role as gods on earth, weaving visions of a dynasty that would reshape the Mediterranean. Yet across the sea, Octavian, the careful, patient heir of Julius Caesar, watched with cold calculation. What Antony and Cleopatra saw as destiny, Octavian saw as opportunity. In Rome, Octavian mastered the art of political storytelling. He understood that battles were not won only by swords, but by words whispered in the Senate and carved into the minds of the people. Cleopatra, he declared, was no queen but a schemer, a foreign seductress who had bewitched a great Roman commander. Antony, once Rome's protector, had been reduced to her servant, The donations of Alexandria were wielded as proof. Antony had dressed like a king, crowned Cleopatra like a goddess, and granted kingdoms to their children, as though Rome's lands were his to give away. The more Octavian painted Cleopatra as a dangerous outsider, the more Rome turned against Antony. Octavia, Antony's abandoned Roman wife, became a living contrast to Cleopatra. She was dutiful, modest, and patient, everything Cleopatra was not. Antony's rejection of her became a wound Octavian could exploit. By 32 BCE, Octavian seized Antony's will from the Vestal Virgin's temple and read it aloud to the Senate. The document, real or forged, declared Antony's wishes to be buried not in Rome, but in Alexandria beside Cleopatra. To Romans, this was the final betrayal. Their general had given his loyalty not to Rome, but to Egypt. The Senate declared war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. By casting the conflict as a defense of Rome against foreign corruption, Octavian gave his cause the air of patriotism and survival. In Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony prepared for the coming storm. Their armies were vast, and their navy glittered across the Mediterranean waters. Cleopatra provided Egypt's wealth, its ships, and its sailors, while Antony summoned his legions from across the east. Together, they commanded a force that seemed invincible, over 200 Ziours and soldiers and nearly 500 warships, many larger and heavier than Rome's fleet. But numbers alone do not decide wars. Behind Antony's walls of ships lay cracks invisible to the eye. Many of his Roman officers resented Cleopatra's influence. They whispered that Antony no longer gave commands as a general, but as her consort. Others feared Octavian's steady propaganda, which promised honor and safety to any who defected. Slowly, defections began, one ally after another slipping away to Octavian's camp. Cleopatra, though proud, recognized the dangers. She argued for caution, for defense rather than reckless attack. Antony, proud and eager to show Roman strength, chose to meet Octavian at sea, off the coast of Actium in western Greece. It was a choice that would shape the destiny of empires. On the morning of September 2, 31 BCE, the waters of the Ionian Sea churned with oars and sails. Antony's massive ships faced Octavian's smaller, but swifter fleet, commanded by Agrippa, Octavian's brilliant admiral. For hours, the battle was a grinding contest of maneuver and attrition, neither side gaining the upper hand. The sea rang with the crash of rams, the roar of fire, and the cries of men locked in combat. Then, in the midst of chaos, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly unfurled its sails and broke away. To Antony's fleet, the sight was stunning. The queen's ships, laden with treasure, streamed southward in full retreat. Was it betrayal? Was it a prearranged plan? Ancient historians never agreed. Antony, torn between duty and devotion, made his choice. He abandoned the fight and followed Cleopatra, leaving his fleet behind. Without their commander, Antony's forces crumbled. Octavian's victory was total. The dream of Antony and Cleopatra's Eastern Empire dissolved on the waves of Actium. The lovers fled to Egypt, but their defeat hung over Alexandria like a storm cloud. One by one, their allies surrendered to Octavian. Rome's legions marched ever closer. Cleopatra, ever resourceful, considered every option. She stockpiled treasures on ships, perhaps planning escape to India. She negotiated secretly with Octavian, offering her crown, her wealth, even her loyalty, so long as her children might survive. Antony, humiliated and despairing, felt his power slip away. In 30 BCE, Octavian invaded Egypt. As his forces closed in on Alexandria, Antony received false news that Cleopatra had taken her own life. Shattered, he fell upon his sword. Mortally wounded, he was carried to Cleopatra's hiding place, where, according to legend, he died in her arms. Cleopatra was left alone to face Octavian. The conqueror demanded she present herself to him in chains, to be paraded in his triumph through the streets of Rome. For Cleopatra, this was a fate worse than death. She had lived her life as a queen, a goddess, a performer of majesty. To be reduced to a prisoner, mocked before the Roman mob, was unthinkable. And so, in August of 30 BCE, Cleopatra chose her own end. Ancient accounts tell of an asp, a venomous snake smuggled in a basket of figs, whose bite brought her a swift and dignified death. Others suggest poison hidden in a comb or ointment. However it happened, Cleopatra died as she had lived, on her own terms, shrouded in myth and spectacle. When Octavian entered Alexandria, he found her lifeless body and ordered her buried beside Antony. Their children were spared but taken to Rome. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, was not so fortunate. Octavian had him quietly executed, declaring, "Two Caesars are one too many." With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt became a Roman province, its treasures flowing into Octavian's coffers. For him, it was the final triumph. He returned to Rome not as Octavian, but as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. For Cleopatra, the story did not end. Her life, her loves, her wit, and her theatrical brilliance became legend. To Romans, she was a warning, the foreign queen who nearly toppled the Republic. To later generations, she became something else, a symbol of power, seduction, and the unyielding will of a woman who refused to be forgotten. The death of Cleopatra in 30 BCE did not silence her story. In fact, it only magnified it. When Octavian, soon to be Augustus, walked through the quiet halls of Alexandria and looked upon the queen's lifeless form, he understood that her image would outlive her reign. A woman who had commanded armies, outwitted Roman generals, and ruled the richest kingdom of the East could not be erased so easily. Yet, Augustus also recognized an opportunity. By shaping her memory, he could control the meaning of her life and, in turn, glorify his own. From the moment Cleopatra was gone, Roman poets, historians, and politicians began weaving a tale about her. They cast her as a dangerous enchantress, a foreign temptress who had bewitched not one, but two of Rome's greatest men. To them, she was less a ruler and more a symbol of corruption, a woman whose beauty and charm had undone the mighty. Virgil, Rome's great poet, alluded to her in his epic The Aeneid. To him, she was the Dark Queen opposing the destiny of Rome, a figure whose downfall cleared the path for Augustus to bring peace to the world. Horace, another poet, spoke of her as reckless, but also noble in her death, admiring her refusal to be humiliated. Plutarch, writing a century later, described her intelligence, her wit, and her ability to captivate anyone she met. Even when hostile, these writers could not escape her magnetism. The story was consistent. Cleopatra had been dangerous, but Augustus had triumphed. By defeating her, he had saved Rome from Eastern decadence. Her life became a mirror in which Roman strength and virtue could shine brighter. Of course, much of this Roman storytelling was political. Cleopatra had been a skilled administrator, an economist who stabilized Egypt's currency, and a polyglot queen fluent in many tongues. She had cultivated Egypt's traditions while also embracing Greek culture, balancing two worlds with ease. She had been a mother, fiercely protective of her children, and a strategist who sought to preserve her dynasty in the face of overwhelming Roman power. But these qualities were not the ones Rome wished to remember. To the conquerors, Cleopatra had to be diminished so that Augustus could be magnified. Her intelligence was painted as cunning, her charisma as sorcery, her love affairs as weakness rather than alliance. The queen was transformed into a character in Rome's theatre of empire. What of Egypt itself? When Cleopatra died, Egypt ceased to be an independent kingdom. It became the personal possession of Augustus, ruled not by a senate, appointed governor, but directly under the emperor's authority. This was unique. No other Roman province was managed so closely. The land of the pharaohs, with its endless grain harvests and ancient temples, became Rome's breadbasket. Yet the memory of Cleopatra lingered among her people. In temple carvings, she was still shown as the living goddess Isis, arms outstretched to the divine child Horus. Local priests continued to honor her in ritual for a time, remembering her not as a fallen queen, but as the last of a sacred line. Over generations, however, her image slowly blended into the larger tapestry of Egyptian kingship. The Roman emperors who followed claimed the mantle of pharaoh themselves, and Cleopatra's memory became entwined with theirs. Ironically, though Augustus sought to reduce her, Cleopatra only grew larger in the Roman imagination. Her dramatic death fascinated audiences. The idea of the serpent's bite, the basket of figs, the tragic queen choosing dignity over shame. It was too perfect a story to fade. Roman painters, poets, and dramatists returned to her again and again. For some, she was the femme fatale, a woman whose charms destroyed great men. For others, she was the tragic heroine, a queen whose boldness and loyalty elevated her above the petty squabbles of generals. This dual image, temptress and heroine, would follow her across the centuries, reshaped by each culture that retold her tale. After the fall of Egypt and Cleopatra's death, her story did not rest with Rome alone. It began to migrate across centuries and continents, reshaped by new cultures, new storytellers, and new needs. The queen who had once stood at the crossroads of empires now lived in the crossroads of memory. Her image shifting like the sands of the desert she once ruled. In the centuries after Rome's decline, Europe entered the early medieval era, and Cleopatra's story became distant, filtered through Latin texts and Christian moral lessons. Few had direct access to the records of Egypt, or even the original Greek accounts. Instead, her life was retold in fragments, in sermons, in moralizing histories, in collections of exemplar stories used to illustrate virtues and vices. To Christian writers, Cleopatra often became a warning. She was not the scholar queen who spoke 9 languages, but rather the woman whose pride and lust led to destruction. In this retelling, her suicide was not seen as noble but as sinful, a refusal to repent. Writers compared her to biblical figures of temptation: Eve, Delilah, Jezebel, women whose beauty was linked to downfall. Yet even in this moralized image, there was fascination. The fact that Cleopatra could ensnare men as powerful as Julius Caesar and Mark Antony meant she carried a kind of dangerous mystique. To some medieval chroniclers, she embodied the unpredictability of women in power, an unsettling figure in a world dominated by male authority. While Europe remembered her through Christian moral tales, the Islamic world approached Cleopatra differently. During the medieval centuries, especially under the Abbasid Caliphate, scholars translated and preserved vast amounts of Greek learning, including works connected to Egypt. In this tradition, Cleopatra was sometimes remembered less as a queen of romance and more as a woman of science and wisdom. Arabic texts describe her as a philosopher, a student of alchemy, medicine, and astrology. She was linked to treatises on poisons and cosmetics, thought to have written manuals on chemistry and healing. To these scholars, Cleopatra was not just a queen of Egypt, but a sage whose knowledge continued to influence practitioners of medicine and early science. This contrast is striking. While Christian Europe made her into a cautionary tale of lust, the Islamic Golden Age sometimes remembered her as a learned ruler, a figure connected to wisdom and discovery. The same woman, viewed through 2 very different lenses, became 2 different characters in history. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe began to rediscover the classical past. Manuscripts of Plutarch, Virgil, and other ancient authors circulated more widely. Renaissance thinkers, artists, and dramatists looked again at Cleopatra, not through the filter of Christian morality, but through a revival of Greco-Roman culture. It was here that Cleopatra began her transformation into one of the most enduring tragic heroines of Western imagination. Painters depicted her final moments with dramatic flourish, her pale body reclining against golden couches, the asp slithering across her arm. Playwrights turned her story into theatre, with scenes of grandeur, passion, and sorrow. She was no longer merely a warning against pride. She was a queen of irresistible power, brought low by love and fate. Artists such as Michelangelo and Raphael sketched Cleopatra. Writers like Boccaccio placed her in collections of famous women, presenting her as both remarkable and flawed. By the late Renaissance, William Shakespeare would give her one of the most memorable afterlives of all in Antony and Cleopatra, where she became a queen of passion and poetry, proud even in defeat. By the end of the Renaissance, 2 faces of Cleopatra had firmly emerged in European culture. One was the seductress, the foreign temptress whose beauty lured men to ruin. The other was the tragic heroine, the noble queen whose downfall carried the weight of classical tragedy. Both were rooted in Rome's original telling, but each was shaped by the needs of later generations. Christian writers emphasized morality, Islamic scholars highlighted wisdom, and Renaissance artists celebrated drama. Cleopatra had become not just a queen of Egypt, but a canvas onto which each culture painted its fears, values, and dreams. Cleopatra's life ended in 30 BCE, but her afterlife in history and culture has lasted more than 2,000 years. Each age has reshaped her image to fit its own anxieties, desires, and fascinations. From a dangerous seductress, to a philosopher queen, to a tragic heroine, Cleopatra has been less a single historical person and more a shifting mirror of human imagination. In the 17th and 18th centuries, European scholars began revisiting Cleopatra's story with a new interest in facts rather than legends. Antiquarians and historians scoured ancient sources, trying to strip away the myths created by Renaissance theatre and medieval moralists. For them, Cleopatra was not primarily a temptress or a tragic heroine, but a political ruler whose decisions shaped the final years of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Yet even here, interpretation was divided. Some Enlightenment thinkers saw her as a shrewd and capable leader, while others still cast her as a manipulative figure whose ambitions exceeded her station. Voltaire, for example, admired her wit but dismissed her politics, treating her reign as a footnote in Rome's larger story. At the same time, Egypt itself remained a place of mystery for Europeans. Without access to hieroglyphs, still undeciphered until the 19th century, Cleopatra's own voice remained silent. She existed mostly in the writings of Romans who had reason to vilify her. This meant that even during the Enlightenment, she was studied more as an idea than as a person. At the end of the 18th century, Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt opened a new chapter in Cleopatra's afterlife. French scholars accompanied the army, documenting monuments, temples, and inscriptions. The description de l'Egypte, published afterward, fueled Europe's fascination with ancient Egypt. Cleopatra became part of this larger Egyptomania. She was imagined as the last torchbearer of a once great civilization, a symbol of the fall of pharaohs into decline. Painters in the 19th century filled their canvases with romanticized visions of her court, golden thrones, exotic animals, veils, and jewels. At the same time, the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 allowed for the eventual deciphering of hieroglyphs in 1822. Scholars could finally access Egypt's own records. Though Cleopatra's name appeared only sparingly, the silence of native Egyptian texts about her left a gap, one that writers and artists eagerly filled with imagination. The 19th century was the golden age of Orientalist art and literature. In this movement, Western painters and novelists depicted the Middle East and North Africa as lands of sensuality, mystery, and decadence. Cleopatra fit this narrative perfectly. She was painted reclining on silk couches, surrounded by attendants, or in the dramatic moment of her death by Asp. Artists like Jean, André Rixen's Hans Makart, and Alexandra Cabanel gave her flowing garments, gilded chambers, and an air of dangerous beauty. These images told the West more about its fantasies of the Orient than about Cleopatra herself. At the same time, Cleopatra entered novels, operas, and stage performances. She was no longer only a figure of history, but a character of spectacle, designed to enchant audiences with visions of exotic passion and doomed romance. In the 20th century, Cleopatra became a star of the silver screen. Silent films in the early 1900s portrayed her as both sultry and majestic. The 1934 film starring Claudette Colbert gave audiences a Cleopatra who was glamorous and witty, commanding attention in glittering costumes. But the most famous portrayal came in 1963, with Elizabeth Taylor in Cleopatra. This film was a cultural phenomenon, infamous for its massive budget and its behind-the-scenes romance between Taylor and Richard Burton. On screen, Cleopatra was not only beautiful but also calculating, playful, and powerful. The film cemented her as a Hollywood icon, a symbol of extravagant luxury and irresistible allure. Since then, Cleopatra has continued to appear in films, television, novels, and even video games. Each new portrayal reimagines her, sometimes as a cunning strategist, sometimes as a doomed lover, sometimes as a feminist icon reclaiming power in a male-dominated world. In recent decades, historians have worked to recover the historical Cleopatra from layers of myth. Archaeology, papyrology, and critical analysis of Roman sources have revealed a woman deeply involved in statecraft. She negotiated with rulers, commanded fleets, reformed finances, and sought to preserve Egyptian independence against overwhelming odds. Modern scholars note that Cleopatra's intelligence and multilingualism made her unusual among the Ptolemies, who often relied heavily on Greek identity. She actively embraced Egyptian culture, presenting herself as both Greek monarch and pharaoh. Her policies were pragmatic, aimed at survival in a world dominated by Rome. Rather than a seductress who bewitched powerful men, Cleopatra is increasingly understood as a capable monarch who used every tool, political, military, cultural, and yes, personal relationships, to maintain her throne. Across 2 millennia, Cleopatra has been remembered in many ways to Rome. She was a dangerous foreign queen who threatened empire. To medieval Christians, she was a sinner and seductress. To Islamic scholars, she was a philosopher and scientist. To Renaissance artists, she was a tragic heroine. To 19th century Orientalists, she was an exotic temptress. To Hollywood, she was a glamorous spectacle. To modern historians, she is a ruler caught between worlds. Each version says less about Cleopatra herself than about the cultures retelling her story. The real Queen of Egypt remains elusive, glimpsed only through fragments of ancient records. Yet perhaps this is part of her enduring power. Of Cleopatra can never be pinned down, and so she continues to live, reshaped again and again. And so the question lingers, do we truly remember Cleopatra, or do we only remember the Cleopatra that each age needs her to be? Cleopatra VO was not only the last queen of Egypt, but also the mother of 4 children. They were born into palaces glittering with wealth, yet their lives were marked by the shadow of Rome. Each child represented both a promise and a threat, heirs to dynasties, potential rulers, or dangerous reminders of Egypt's independence. Their stories are little known, for history's spotlight rarely leaves Cleopatra herself. Yet by following their traces, we glimpse the fragile afterlife of a dynasty that ended with their mother's death. Cleopatra's first child was Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar, better known by his nickname, Caesarion, Little Caesar. He was born in 47 BCE, during Cleopatra's time with Julius Caesar in Alexandria. For Cleopatra, Caesarion was more than a child. He was a living bond with Rome's most powerful man. Cleopatra presented Caesarion as the legitimate son of Caesar, though Roman opinion was divided. Some in Rome scoffed at the idea, insisting Caesar had never publicly acknowledged the boy. Yet in Egypt, Caesarion's status was elevated. He appeared with Cleopatra on temple walls, depicted as a pharaoh beside his mother. Together they were presented as Isis and Horus reborn, linking their rule to Egypt's most sacred traditions. As a young child, Caesarion traveled with Cleopatra to Rome in 46 BCE when she visited Caesar. There, in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, the boy was introduced to Roman society. Rumors swirled in the streets. Had Caesar fathered a king of Egypt? And if so, what might that mean for Rome's own politics? After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra returned to Egypt with Caesarion. The boy became her co-ruler in name, though his mother retained real power. Still, Caesarion's presence mattered deeply. He was a symbol that Cleopatra's dynasty was not merely Greek or Egyptian, but also tied to Rome itself. Cleopatra later had 3 children with Mark Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. Their births carried enormous political weight, for Antony was one of Rome's strongest men, and his union with Cleopatra symbolized a blending of East and West. Alexander Helios, whose name means son, was born in 40 BCE. Cleopatra gave him titles and symbols that tied him to solar deities, presenting him as a radiant future king. Cleopatra Selene, his twin sister, was associated with the moon, In art and ceremony, the siblings represented cosmic harmony. The sun and moon joined in balance. Ptolemy Philadelphus, the youngest, was born in 36 BCE. His name echoed earlier Ptolemaic kings and linked him to dynastic tradition. Antony and Cleopatra staged elaborate ceremonies to present their children to the world. The most famous was the donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE. In this grand spectacle, Antony declared territories across the eastern Mediterranean as gifts to Cleopatra and her children. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings. Caesarion was named King of Kings, and the younger children were each given kingdoms in waiting. For Rome, this was an outrage. Antony appeared to be carving up Roman provinces to hand them to his foreign mistress and her brood. For Cleopatra, however, it was a bold attempt to secure her dynasty's future and bind her children to a vision of empire that could rival Rome's. In Alexandria, Cleopatra's children grew up in an atmosphere of luxury and tension. They were raised among scholars, priests, and courtiers, surrounded by the riches of Egypt. The city itself was a vibrant hub of culture, where Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, and Roman politics collided daily. Cleopatra likely ensured her children were educated in multiple languages: Greek, Egyptian, and perhaps even Latin. They would have studied rhetoric, history, and philosophy, as well as the religious rituals of Egypt. Each child embodied a bridge between world's heirs of Alexander's Greek Empire, rulers in the Egyptian tradition, and symbols tied to Rome through their fathers. But the walls of the palace could not shut out the larger storm. Rome's civil wars raged, and their parents' fates grew ever more uncertain. From their earliest days, the children of Cleopatra lived under the shadow of choices made by Caesar, Antony, and Octavian. When Cleopatra and Mark Antony chose to die by their own hands in 30 BCE, their children's world collapsed overnight. The glittering palace of Alexandria, with its libraries, banquets, and divine ceremonies, became a prison. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, entered Alexandria not merely as a conqueror of a city, but as the heir to an empire that swallowed Egypt whole. For Cleopatra's children, survival was suddenly a fragile thread, dependent on the mercy of Rome. Of all Cleopatra's children, Caesarion bore the greatest danger. As the alleged son of Julius Caesar, he carried a potential claim to Rome itself. In Egypt, he had been titled King of Kings. To Octavian, he was a living threat, a rival whose very existence challenged his supremacy. Ancient sources tell us that Caesarion was about 17 when his mother died. Cleopatra, before taking her life, is said to have sent him away toward the Red Sea, perhaps to India, hoping he could escape. But his flight was short-lived. Octavian lured him back with promises of safety. The young king never reached adulthood. He was captured and executed on Octavian's orders. A Roman historian later wrote that Octavian was advised with the phrase, "Too many Caesars is not a good thing." In other words, Caesarion's death was framed not as cruelty, but as necessity. To Rome, one Caesar, Octavian, was enough. Thus ended the boy who might have been a bridge between two worlds, reduced instead to a shadowy figure remembered only as Cleopatra's doomed heir. The three younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were treated differently. They were far too young to pose an immediate political threat. Instead, they were paraded in Octavian's victory procession in Rome, a public display meant to humiliate their heritage. Imagine the scene: the streets of Rome filled with cheering crowds, soldiers carrying spoils from Egypt, and among them the children of Antony and Cleopatra, dressed as royalty yet stripped of their kingdom. The people of Rome gazed at them as curiosities, symbols of Egypt's downfall. Their parents were gone, their titles worthless, their futures uncertain. Yet Octavian did not order their deaths. Instead, he handed them into the care of his sister, Octavia, who had once been Mark Antony's wife. In Octavia's household, the children grew up in Rome, far removed from the palaces of Alexandria. Of the twins, Alexander Helios disappears first from the historical record. He was given ceremonial titles during his childhood, such as King of Armenia, but there is no mention of him in adulthood. It is possible he died young, perhaps from illness, or perhaps he lived quietly in obscurity. Rome, after all, had little interest in nurturing Egyptian princes. Ptolemy Philadelphus, the youngest, shares the same fate of silence. No record survives of his adulthood. Like his brother, he may have died before reaching maturity. If so, his life was swallowed by the anonymity of Octavian's Rome, a boy born for kingship reduced to a name half forgotten. In their absence, it was their sister, Cleopatra Selene, who carried forward the last spark of her family's legacy. Cleopatra Selene, unlike her brothers, lived to adulthood and played a surprising role in history. After being raised in Octavia's household, she was married to Juba II of Mauritania, a Roman client king in North Africa. This marriage was both political and symbolic. Rome could remove her from the center of power while still using her heritage to legitimize new dynasties on the empire's edges. In Mauritania, Cleopatra Selene built a new life. She ruled alongside Juba with intelligence and grace, and her presence brought Egyptian and Greek culture into North Africa. Coins from her reign depict her with royal symbols of both Egypt and Rome, a reminder of her unique lineage. Through her, Cleopatra's bloodline continued, not in Alexandria, but on the far western edge of the Mediterranean. Her children would grow into nobility, blending into Roman aristocracy. Though the Ptolemaic dynasty was officially extinct, its echoes survived quietly in new lands. The story of Cleopatra's children is one of contrast. Caesarion, executed for his potential, while his younger siblings were spared only to vanish into silence or exile. Behind the glittering names, Helios, Selene, Philadelphus, were real children, torn from their homeland and thrust into the theatre of Roman politics. When Octavian stood victorious, Egypt became a province of Rome, and the children of its last queen became symbols, either extinguished or absorbed into the empire. Their individual stories remind us that dynasties end, not only with great battles and suicides, but also in the quiet erasure of children whose lives were deemed too dangerous to remember. The dynasty that Cleopatra fought so fiercely to preserve did not collapse in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow unraveling across years and generations. After her death, and the deaths of Antony and Caesarion, the line of the Ptolemies survived only in fragments, carried forward mostly through her daughter, Cleopatra Selene. This last section looks at how her legacy spread far from Egypt, how her descendants blended into Rome's world, and how memory of the dynasty faded into legend. When Cleopatra Selene married Juba II, she entered a union carefully arranged by Augustus. Juba himself was no stranger to imperial manipulation. He had been taken to Rome as a child after his father, King Juba I of Numidia, lost a war against Julius Caesar. Educated in Rome, he became both Romanized and loyal, and Augustus rewarded him by giving him control of Mauritania, a vast kingdom in North Africa. Together, Cleopatra Selene and Juba II ruled as client monarchs, loyal to Rome, but with a degree of independence. Their kingdom was a cultural crossroads. They filled their capital city, Isles' modern Churchill in Algeria, with Roman-style buildings, Greek art and Egyptian motifs. Temples bore symbols of Isis, a goddess Cleopatra herself had been linked to. Coins minted in their reign reveal much about Cleopatra Selene's status. On some, her face appears alongside Juba's, suggesting she was not a passive queen, but an active co-ruler. The coins also carry Egyptian imagery, crescent moons and solar crowns, that echoed her heritage. She never forgot who she was, even while living far from Alexandria. Despite this outward success, Cleopatra Selene must have lived with a sense of exile. Born into the marble halls and golden thrones of Alexandria, she grew up in Rome under Octavia's guardianship, and then was married off to rule a kingdom far from both Egypt and the center of Roman politics. Her reign was prosperous, but it was not Egypt. In Alexandria, the palaces and temples of her ancestors had been taken over by Roman governors. The Ptolemaic dynasty, that had lasted for nearly 3 centuries, ended with her mother's death, and there was no path for Selene to reclaim it. Her role was to be useful to Augustus, to embody a surviving royal tradition without threatening Roman supremacy. Still, in the small acts of coinage, temple building, and ceremony, Cleopatra Selene stitched fragments of Egypt into the fabric of Mauritania. Through her, the Egyptian queen's legacy was preserved, even if only faintly. Cleopatra Selene and Jubitabu had at least one son, often identified as Ptolemy of Mauritania. He grew up as a Roman citizen and inherited the throne of Mauritania after his father's death. His name, Ptolemy, was itself a deliberate preservation of his Egyptian heritage, linking him back to the dynasty of Alexander's successors. For a time, he was respected by Rome. He even visited the city and was honored there. But his fate, like that of so many heirs, ended in violence. In 40 CE, the Emperor Caligula ordered his execution. The reason is uncertain, perhaps jealousy, perhaps political paranoia. With his death, the last known descendant of Cleopatra vanished from history. The bloodline that had stretched from Macedon to Egypt, from Alexander the Great's generals to Rome's most famous queen, ended in silence. Today, traces of Cleopatra Selene's reign survive in ruins. In Churchill, remnants of Roman-style theatres and mosaics still stand, bearing witness to the cultural blend she and Juba fostered. Nearby is the Royal Mausoleum of Mauritania, a massive stone monument believed to be her tomb. Its circular form resembles both a Roman structure and an Egyptian pyramid, as if deliberately built to honor both halves of her identity. It is here, perhaps, that Cleopatra Selene was laid to rest, far from the Nile, but not without reminders of her heritage. Visitors to the site, even today, sense the quiet power of its design, a monument not only to a queen, but to the final echoes of a dynasty. What became of Cleopatra's other children is uncertain. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus vanish from records. Some historians suggest they died in childhood or early adulthood. Others speculate they may have lived in quiet anonymity, their names erased so they could not become symbols for rebellion. Whatever their fates, it was Cleopatra Selene alone who carried the dynasty into the next generation. In Roman memory, Cleopatra herself was vilified. Poets like Horace and Propertius painted her as a dangerous foreign temptress, the embodiment of Eastern decadence, threatening Roman order. Her children, therefore, could never be celebrated in the capital, yet in Mauritania, Cleopatra Selene reshaped this narrative, ruling not as a dangerous outsider, but as a queen of dignity and culture. Her reign offered a quieter ending for her mother's legacy. No longer at the center of Mediterranean politics, but still woven into its fabric. By the time Ptolemy of Mauritania was executed, the world had moved on. Egypt was firmly Roman. Alexandria had become one of the great cities of the empire, but its rulers no longer bore the names of the Ptolemies. And so, the once mighty dynasty of Cleopatra and her children dissolved into memory. Their palaces were reused, their temples repurposed, their heirs scattered. What remained was not power, but stories, fragments of coins, monuments in distant lands, and echoes in Roman histories. The story of Cleopatra's children is not one of triumph, but of survival, exile, and eventual erasure. And yet, in that erasure lies a kind of endurance. For even in their fading, they remind us that dynasties are not eternal, and that the world is always reshaped by the tides of empire. Cleopatra's bloodline ended in Mauritania, but her name endured, more enduring than Augustus, or Juba, or any of the others who sought to define her. Her children, remembered or forgotten, were the final chapter of a dynasty that once dreamed of ruling both Egypt and Rome. Long before Cleopatra's arrival in history books, Alexandria had already become one of the busiest and most cosmopolitan cities in the ancient world. Founded by Alexander the Great and perfected by the Ptolemies, the city was filled with grand palaces, bustling marketplaces, and the famous Library of Alexandria. But behind the marble columns and statues, the real life of the city pulsed through its ordinary workers. Among the most respected of these were the scribes, the men who wrote, recorded, and preserved the words of the kingdom. In Cleopatra's time, being a scribe was both an ancient and a prestigious profession. Egypt had relied on scribes for thousands of years, and even under Greek rulers, their work remained vital. To explore the daily life of a scribe in Cleopatra's Alexandria is to step into the quieter side of history, where ink and papyrus carried as much weight as swords and ships. The path to becoming a scribe began in childhood. A boy, rarely a girl, though there are occasional mentions of women scribes, would be sent to a special school, often attached to a temple or palace office. There, he would learn to read and write not one, but multiple scripts. Egyptian writing in Cleopatra's day came in different forms: hieroglyphs, the sacred, picture-based script carved on temples and monuments; hieratic, a cursive shorthand of hieroglyphs used for religious texts; demotic, the everyday script used in contracts, letters, and legal records; and increasingly, Greek, the language of the Ptolemaic court and the upper classes. A skilled scribe had to master all of these. His lessons would have been repetitive and often exhausting, copying the same phrases, learning long lists of words, memorizing entire passages. Yet for those who succeeded, the reward was social mobility. A scribe was respected, paid, and sometimes even exempt from manual labor or military service. The scribe's world was shaped by small but powerful tools. His writing kit would usually include reed pens, calamos, sharpened carefully to a fine point; ink cakes, usually black made from soot, and red made from ochre, both mixed with water before use; papyrus sheets, pressed and smoothed from the stalks of the papyrus plant, which grew along the Nile; wax tablets, used for drafting quick notes or practicing before committing words to papyrus. Papyrus was expensive, so mistakes were frowned upon. A scribe learned to keep his hand steady, his strokes clean, and his ink flowing just right. The scratch of the reed against papyrus would have been one of the most familiar sounds in Alexandria's offices and archives. A scribe's duties varied depending on his position. Some worked in the royal administration, recording taxes, land deeds, and decrees. Others served in temples, copying hymns, prayers, and rituals. Still others were employed by merchants to draw up contracts, letters of credit, and shipping records. In a city like Alexandria, with its huge harbor and constant flow of goods, scribes were in high demand. Every ship that docked needed records of its cargo. Every merchant needed receipts. Every official needed reports to send to higher authorities. Without scribes, the machinery of the city would grind to a halt. Their work was not only practical, but also archival. The greatest scribes contributed to the Library of Alexandria, where texts from across the known world were collected. Some copied Egyptian works into Greek, others translated Greek into Demotic, ensuring that knowledge could pass between cultures. Imagine a scribe in Cleopatra's Alexandria waking before dawn. He would wash, dress in a simple linen tunic, and eat a modest breakfast of bread, figs, and perhaps a little cheese. Then he would walk through the crowded streets, passing merchants setting up stalls of grain, spices, and fish. Arriving at his office, perhaps a chamber attached to a temple or a shaded room near the docks, he would set out his tools. The morning might be spent drafting letters for a merchant sending goods to Cyprus. Later, he might copy a tax record for farmland near the Nile Delta. By afternoon, he could be in the service of a priest, carefully transcribing hymns to Isis or Horus. Work was steady, sometimes monotonous, but rarely backbreaking. Unlike farmers or laborers, scribes did not toil in the sun or risk their lives in battle. Their labor was of the mind and the hand, and it carried a certain dignity in Egypt. Scribes held a place of respect higher than that of many craftsmen. Ancient proverbs even praised them. A scribe's body is sleek, he does not carry a hoe. Though Cleopatra's world was one of Greek influence and Roman intrusion, this old Egyptian view persisted. A family with a son trained as a scribe had reason to be proud. Still, not every scribe became wealthy. Some lived modestly, dependent on the wages of their employers. Others, however, rose high, becoming overseers of archives or advisors to governors. In rare cases, scribes entered royal service and stood close to the great figures of the age. One of the most fascinating aspects of being a scribe in Cleopatra's Alexandria was the city's cultural mix. Documents might be written in Demotic for local Egyptians, in Greek for the ruling classes, and occasionally in Latin for Roman envoys. A skilled scribe might find himself switching scripts multiple times in a single day. This multilingual world made Alexandria unique. A scribe who knew his languages well could act as a bridge between communities: Egyptian farmers, Greek merchants, Jewish scholars, Roman officials, all of whom lived and worked side by side in the city. The daily life of a scribe in Cleopatra's Alexandria was not glamorous, but it was essential. While generals marched and queens schemed, it was the scribes who ensured that words endured, that contracts were honored, and that memories of an age were preserved in ink. The work of a scribe in Cleopatra's Alexandria went far beyond the mundane tasks of recording taxes or drawing up contracts. For many, the profession carried them into the heart of Egypt's intellectual and spiritual world. Nowhere was this more evident than in their ties to the Library of Alexandria, the temples of the gods, and the fragile balance of knowledge and power. At the very center of Alexandria's fame was the Great Library, said to be the most ambitious repository of knowledge the ancient world had ever seen. While the myths of its size and eventual destruction have been exaggerated by centuries of storytelling, the library was nonetheless an extraordinary institution. Scribes played a crucial role here. Some were tasked with copying texts brought in from abroad. Ships docking at Alexandria's harbors were rumored to have their scrolls temporarily confiscated, copied by scribes, and then returned, or sometimes replaced with copies while the originals were kept. In this way, the Ptolemaic kings built a treasure house of words. The scribes who worked in the library dealt with manuscripts from every corner of the known world: Greek philosophy, Babylonian astronomy, Egyptian medicine, Indian mathematics, and Hebrew scripture. Their work required precision. A single mistaken character could alter a formula, confuse a myth, or misrepresent a law. This was more than clerical labor. It was a form of guardianship over human thought. For the scribes, life in the library also meant access to a world far wider than most Alexandrians could imagine. To spend one's days copying passages of Homer, translating Egyptian hymns into Greek, or preserving old medical recipes was to live among the voices of distant ages. Beyond the library, scribes also served Egypt's many temples, and here their role was as much spiritual as administrative. Temples remained powerful centers of Egyptian society, even under Greek rule. They were not only places of worship, but also hubs of economic activity, owning land, collecting rents, and employing workers. The temple scribe kept these records, ensuring that offerings were accounted for, fields were taxed correctly, and priests received their due. But their duties did not stop at ledgers. Many temple scribes were entrusted with the copying of sacred texts, rituals, hymns, and spells. Some worked on the Book of the Dead, the ancient collection of funerary spells designed to guide souls through the afterlife. Even in Cleopatra's age, this tradition lingered, though often now written in the Demotic script rather than hieroglyphs. Copying such texts was considered an act of piety. Every character had to be perfect, for the soul of the deceased depended on the words being correct. In this sense, the scribe stood halfway between priest and craftsman, a servant of the gods through the medium of ink. One of the more surprising areas where scribes were involved was medicine. Medical knowledge in ancient Egypt was usually written in collections that combined practical treatments with magical incantations. A physician might prescribe both an herbal paste for a wound and a spoken charm to accompany it. Scribes preserved these medical papyri, such as the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which contained everything from surgical techniques to recipes for ointments. In Alexandria, where Greek and Egyptian traditions mixed, scribes might copy works by Hippocrates alongside older Egyptian remedies. For a sick patient, the scribe's role might not be visible, but without him, the doctor's tools of knowledge would not exist. Being a scribe was not without its dangers. Knowledge was powerful, and in times of political upheaval, those who controlled it could be seen as a threat. a scribe who copied sensitive documents, royal decrees, military orders, diplomatic correspondence, might be caught between rival factions. In Alexandria, intrigue was never far away. Cleopatra's reign was marked by shifting alliances with Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony, and constant Roman interference. A misplaced letter or a leaked copy could place a scribe in deadly danger. To be trusted with ink was also to be trusted with secrets. Even the Library of Alexandria itself may have suffered in such struggles. Some accounts suggest fires during Julius Caesar's siege of the city damaged parts of it. If so, scribes would have been among the first to see their life's work, the words they had so carefully copied, vanish in smoke. Despite their elevated respect, scribes had to tread carefully in Alexandria's layered society. Greek elites sometimes looked down on native Egyptians, and the old prestige of the Egyptian scribe was not always recognized by the Greek-speaking court. A scribe who could master Greek alongside Demotic had better chances of employment, but it also meant walking between two worlds. Some scribes leaned into Greek culture, writing in its flowing letters and quoting Aristotle. Others held tightly to Egyptian traditions, preserving hieroglyphic texts, even as they fell out of daily use. In both cases, the scribe became a living bridge between civilizations, shaping how one culture understood the other. One final, often overlooked aspect of a scribe's role was his connection to storytelling. In a largely illiterate society, the written word was not meant only to be read silently, it was meant to be spoken aloud. Scribes often recited documents in public, announcing decrees, reading contracts to illiterate parties, or telling aloud the stories they had copied. In this way, a scribe was not only a writer but also a voice. His words carried authority, whether they were royal orders, religious hymns, or lines from Homer. For the ordinary citizen, it was often through the scribe that the written world became real. In Cleopatra's Alexandria, the life of a scribe was a delicate mixture of the practical and the sacred. He could be a clerk in the morning, a translator by noon, a copyist of hymns in the afternoon, and a reader of contracts in the evening. His ink-connected worlds preserved memories and carried secrets. And while his life was quieter than that of the queen or the generals, it was no less essential. When Cleopatra's reign drew to its dramatic end, her alliance with Mark Antony collapsing at Actium, her final stand in Alexandria, and her death in 30 BCE, the fate of Egypt changed forever. The Ptolemaic kingdom was no more. It became a Roman province, and with it, the world of the Egyptian scribe entered a new chapter. The Romans did not share the same reverence for Egyptian scribes that native Egyptians had nurtured for centuries. In Rome itself, scribes were often considered freedmen or slaves, valued for their skills, but not honored with the same cultural prestige. Yet in Egypt, the profession survived. Roman administrators quickly realized the usefulness of scribes who could read and write in Demotic, hieroglyphs, and Greek. Taxes still needed to be collected, contracts drawn, and temple estates managed. The bureaucratic machinery of Egypt was too complex to function without the men trained in its scripts. A scribe under Roman rule might now record land surveys for imperial estates, tally grain shipments bound for Rome, or translate between Greek-speaking governors and Egyptian villagers. The ink remained the same, though the authority behind it had changed. Over the next few centuries, the ancient writing systems that had given Egyptian scribes their sacred aura began to fade. Greek became the language of government, and later Latin intruded as well. Demotic lingered in local contracts and temple inscriptions, but it too began to disappear. By the 4th century CE, hieroglyphs, the script that had once been seen as the divine language of the gods, were no longer understood. The scribes of Cleopatra's time, who could still move between hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek, became the last custodians of a fading tradition. In this sense, the scribes of Cleopatra's Alexandria were living at a threshold. They were heirs to a 3,000-year-old profession, yet they were also witnesses to its slow unraveling. Though the role diminished under Roman rule, the image of the Egyptian scribe endured. Statues of seated scribes, holding their papyrus scrolls, were already ancient in Cleopatra's time and remained symbols of wisdom. These statues often showed the scribe with an attentive expression, knees bent, papyrus unfurled, a posture of readiness to record the world. In later centuries, when Greek and Roman scholars looked back on Egypt, they often recalled it as a land of mysterious wisdom. Much of that reputation was owed to the quiet labor of the scribes. They had been the ones to preserve medical recipes, astronomical calculations, hymns to the gods, and stories of the pharaohs. Even when the scripts themselves were forgotten, fragments of their knowledge filtered through translations, influencing medicine, mathematics, and philosophy far beyond Egypt's borders. It is easy to think only of Cleopatra, Caesar, and Antony when we imagine Alexandria in the 1st century BCE. But in truth, the city was also filled with men and women whose names never entered the history books. Take an ordinary scribe. Let us imagine him, bent over his writing board in a modest home, not far from the harbour. His reed pen scratches across the surface of a papyrus sheet, recording a land lease for a farmer in the delta. The work is repetitive, and the pay is modest, but he does it carefully. That contract, signed and sealed, may survive longer than the farmer's house, longer even than the scribe's own descendants. In fragments of papyrus dug from the sands of Egypt, modern archaeologists still uncover such contracts, written in steady Demotic or Greek script. The names of ordinary people, landowners, tenants, witnesses, have outlived their bodies because a scribe once pressed ink to papyrus. In this way, the scribes achieved a kind of immortality, not for themselves, but for others. Their words made memory possible. By the time Christianity spread through Egypt, and later Islam, the old scribal traditions were almost gone. New scripts, new languages, and new religions transformed the land. Yet the figure of the Egyptian scribe never disappeared entirely. Even centuries later, when scholars puzzled over strange carvings on temple walls, it was the image of the scribe they remembered, the one who knew the secret words. The Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799, would eventually unlock hieroglyphs, and with it the voices of the scribes of Cleopatra's age would be heard again. Their careful copying, their precise signs, their quiet work, once thought buried, was revealed anew. The life of a scribe in Cleopatra's Alexandria was neither glamorous nor loud. It was a life of discipline, patience, and ink. He was a guardian of memory, a servant of both king and temple, and an unseen participant in the greatest dramas of his age. When Cleopatra met Caesar, when Antony waged war, when Rome absorbed Egypt, scribes were there in the background, recording, preserving, ensuring the details survived. And though their profession faded, their influence never truly vanished. The world still reads their words. Their ink, dried more than 2,000 years ago, still whispers. The years following the death of Julius Caesar left Cleopatra in a dangerous position. She had achieved a great deal through her alliance with Caesar. She had secured her throne in Egypt, safeguarded the Ptolemaic dynasty, and ensured the future of her son, Caesarion. Yet the world of Roman politics was changing swiftly, and the balance of power shifted with every new decree and assassination in Rome. When Caesar fell beneath the daggers of his assassins in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's greatest protector was gone. Rome, however, remained as threatening and as essential to her reign as ever. If Egypt was to survive, Cleopatra would need to navigate a new set of Roman rulers, and none loomed larger than Mark Antony. Mark Antony was no ordinary Roman commander. By the time Cleopatra considered how to approach him, he had already made a name for himself as one of Caesar's most loyal generals. He was known not only for his battlefield skills, but also for his rough charisma. Where Caesar had been intellectual, precise, and politically cunning, Antony was larger than life, a man of appetites, laughter, and bravado. Romans whispered about his indulgence in feasts and wine, but no one doubted his bravery in battle. After Caesar's assassination, Antony positioned himself as one of the protectors of Caesar's legacy, seizing power in the turbulent vacuum that followed. Cleopatra, watching events unfold from Alexandria, faced a troubling reality. The new order in Rome was being carved out by three men: the second triumvirate Octavian, Caesar's heir, Marcus Lepidus, a political broker, and Mark Antony, the seasoned general. Of these, Antony commanded the legions in the east, meaning his influence extended over territories closest to Egypt. If Cleopatra wished to preserve her throne and keep Caesarion recognized as Caesar's rightful son, Antony's favor was indispensable. The stage for their meeting was set in 41 BCE, when Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus, a city in Asia Minor. Officially, he demanded her presence to explain why she had not supported Rome more actively during Caesar's civil wars. Unofficially, it was clear to everyone, Cleopatra included, that this was a test. Would the Queen of Egypt present herself as a compliant client ruler, bowing to Roman authority, or would she find a way to impress Antony and negotiate on equal footing? The answer would determine whether Egypt retained its fragile independence or fell entirely under Roman control. Cleopatra's decision was bold, and it played perfectly to Antony's personality. She did not arrive at Tarsus as a supplicant queen dressed in mourning robes. Instead, she staged one of the most famous entrances of antiquity. Ancient writers, Plutarch above all, record the details with fascination. She sailed up the Cydnus River on a magnificent barge, its stern plated in gold, its sails dyed a rich purple, the most costly color of the ancient world. The oars beat in rhythm to music, their silver tips catching the sunlight as they dipped into the water. Cleopatra herself reclined beneath a canopy dressed as the goddess Aphrodite or Isis, depending on the source, surrounded by attendants dressed as cupids and nymphs. Incense wafted from censers, filling the air with exotic scents. The effect was overwhelming. Tarsus, an ordinary provincial city, suddenly found itself host to a theatrical performance of divine proportions. Crowds lined the banks of the river to catch a glimpse of the spectacle. By the time Cleopatra stepped ashore, Antony's soldiers and officials were already whispering comparisons between their general and the god Dionysus. Welcomed by a goddess, the message was clear. Cleopatra was not simply a regional monarch dragged before a Roman commander. She was a queen who ruled by divine sanction, a woman who could stand as Antony's equal. Antony, who was famous for his own love of luxury and dramatic gestures, was enchanted. He invited Cleopatra to a banquet, but she cleverly reversed the invitation and instead hosted Antony on her ship. There, she outed Roman expectations once again. The feasts were extravagant, the entertainment endless. Dishes of rare delicacies were served, and golden plates were sometimes tossed into the river after use, just to demonstrate the wealth of Egypt. Whether every detail was literal or later exaggerated, the impression was the same: Cleopatra could match, and even surpass, Antony in the art of spectacle. It was not just the displays of wealth that impressed Antony. Cleopatra possessed a quick wit and sharp intelligence, qualities that Roman historians begrudgingly acknowledged even while painting her as a seductress. In conversation, she could hold her own against the greatest generals and statesmen of her age. For Antony, who valued loyalty but also enjoyed cleverness, Cleopatra's charm was irresistible. The two quickly found themselves drawn together, not merely as political allies, but as partners in a personal sense. For Cleopatra, the stakes were higher than mere romance. She needed Antony's military support to secure her throne against rivals, both within Egypt and abroad. Even years after she had seized power with Caesar's help, Egypt was not free from internal tensions. The Nile kingdom was wealthy, but its rulers had often been toppled by palace coups, ambitious siblings, or foreign interference. Antony's legions represented a shield against these dangers. Moreover, Antony was one of the only men powerful enough to ensure that Caesarion might be recognized as Caesar's true heir, a possibility that threatened Octavian's claim in Rome. For Antony, Cleopatra offered more than charm and wealth. Egypt's treasury was vast, and his ambitions in the east required enormous resources. Gold, ships, grain, and manpower, all of these Cleopatra could provide. Her support would allow him to wage campaigns against Rome's eastern enemies, especially the Parthians. In her, Antony found not only companionship, but also the key to sustaining his military ambitions. Their alliance, however, was not without risk. In Rome, Antony's enemies, and even his allies, watched with suspicion. To them, Cleopatra represented the lure of the East, a dangerous distraction for a Roman commander who should have been focused on the stability of the Republic. Tales of Antony being bewitched by the Egyptian queen spread quickly. Gossip claimed he abandoned Roman discipline for Egyptian indulgence, that he spent his days in feasting and drinking rather than strategy. Some of these stories were surely exaggerated, spread by Octavian's propagandists, but the seeds of suspicion were planted early. In Alexandria, however, the pair's union blossomed. Cleopatra welcomed Antony into her city, and together they indulged in the kind of life that Roman senators would later use as ammunition against them. They formed a private society, sometimes called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to nights of drinking, games, and extravagant amusements. Yet beneath the laughter and feasting, serious politics were always at play. Cleopatra and Antony were cementing an alliance that could alter the fate of the Mediterranean. Their children would embody this alliance. In time, Cleopatra bore Antony twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Later, she would give birth to another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. These children represented more than a family. They symbolized the blending of Egypt's royal blood with Rome's most powerful general. For Cleopatra, this was a continuation of her strategy to root her dynasty in connections that spanned beyond Egypt, ensuring its survival in a world dominated by Rome. The first meeting at Tarsus, then, was no mere introduction. It was the beginning of a partnership that combined politics, passion, and ambition. Cleopatra had once tied her fortunes to Julius Caesar, but now she found in Antony a man whose temperament, appetite for grandeur, and need for Egypt's resources matched her own. Together, they began to imagine a world in which Alexandria, not Rome, could stand at the center of power. Yet even as their relationship deepened, storm clouds gathered. Rome was never forgiving when its leaders seemed too enamored of foreign queens, nor when its generals appeared to prioritize pleasure over duty. Octavian, ever watchful, would later seize upon Antony's bond with Cleopatra as proof that his rival had betrayed Rome. But in these early days, in the shimmering waters of Tarsus and the bustling palaces of Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony seemed to embody a new vision of power, one that might yet rival the Republic itself. And so, the question lingered: had Antony, like Caesar before him, found in Cleopatra the key to building something greater than Rome, or had he set his feet upon the path to ruin? The meeting at Tarsus had forged more than an alliance. By the time Cleopatra and Antony returned to Alexandria, their partnership was already evolving into something larger, a blending of politics and intimacy, ambition and spectacle. Cleopatra had succeeded once again in transforming a Roman general into a patron, protector, and partner. Yet this time, the stakes were higher. With Caesar, she had ensured her throne. With Antony, she was now weaving a vision that challenged the very order of the Roman Republic. In Alexandria, the queen welcomed Antony not simply as a foreign guest, but as a co-ruler of sorts. He was housed in the splendor of the royal palace, a sprawling complex of marble halls, colonnades, and gardens overlooking the Mediterranean. There, Cleopatra introduced him to the rhythms of Egyptian royal life, a life defined by ceremony, luxury, and divine symbolism. Antony, whose Roman upbringing emphasized discipline and austerity, found himself immersed in a culture that celebrated abundance. And rather than resist, he embraced it wholeheartedly. The pair became inseparable. Ancient sources described their life in Alexandria as one long season of revelry. They formed an exclusive circle of companions, later remembered as the inimitable livers. Together, they feasted on elaborate banquets, played games, dressed in disguises, and roamed the city by night, mingling with commoners in playful adventures. While Roman historians recorded these stories with disapproval, seeing only indulgence and decadence, They also reveal something deeper. Cleopatra and Antony were not only lovers, but performers, crafting an image of themselves as rulers who embodied both power and joy. Yet beneath the laughter, serious business was underway. Cleopatra understood that Antony's presence in Alexandria was not a romantic indulgence, but a chance to secure her dynasty's future. The queen had long pursued the idea of reviving the Ptolemaic Empire to its former glory. With Antony's legions at her back, this dream seemed possible. Egypt could once again dominate the eastern Mediterranean, projecting power into Syria, Cyprus, and beyond. Antony, for his part, required immense resources for his planned campaigns against the Parthians, Rome's formidable eastern enemy. Cleopatra provided those resources: gold from the royal treasury, grain from the Nile, and ships from the harbors of Alexandria. Their bond was not only personal but strategic. Each gave the other what they could not achieve alone. It was in these years that Cleopatra bore Antony twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Their birth in 40 BCE carried immense symbolic weight. They were living proof of a union that blended Egypt's divine monarchy with Rome's military might. Cleopatra presented them not simply as children, but as heirs to a new kind of dynasty, one that could bridge east and west. Later, a third child, Ptolemy Philadelphus, would further extend this royal line. But while Alexandria celebrated, Rome murmured with suspicion. Antony had obligations in the west. He was not merely a wandering general, but one of the three rulers of the Roman world, bound by the Second Triumvirate. His partners in power, Octavian in Italy and Lepidus in Africa, watched closely as he spent months in the Egyptian capital. Gossip reached Rome that Antony had been bewitched by Cleopatra, that he had abandoned his Roman wife and obligations for the luxuries of the East. These rumors were not idle chatter, they were political weapons. To restore balance, Antony eventually returned to Rome. The city was in turmoil, as it so often was, with Octavian consolidating his position and Antony's own supporters demanding his presence. There, Antony faced the necessity of repairing his alliance with Octavian. A marriage sealed the reconciliation. Antony wed Octavia, Octavian's sister, a woman celebrated for her dignity and loyalty. The union was a calculated act, meant to reassure Rome that Antony remained committed to its traditions. For a time, it worked. The marriage produced children, and Octavia played the role of mediator between her husband and her brother. Yet Cleopatra remained in the background, and Alexandria was never far from Antony's heart. Even as he campaigned and governed in the west, the Egyptian queen continued to shape his policies. Letters, envoys, and promises bound them across the sea. By 37 BCE, Antony returned to the east to prepare for war against Parthia, and once again, he turned to Cleopatra for support. Octavia, dutiful and dignified, was left behind in Rome, while Cleopatra welcomed Antony back into her palace. This renewed partnership deepened the rift between Antony and Octavian. To Octavian, Cleopatra was more than a foreign queen. She was a symbol of everything dangerous about Antony's ambitions. Together, they seemed to be building an alternative center of power, one that rivaled Rome itself. Octavian understood the political danger. If Antony triumphed in the east with Cleopatra's support, he might one day march west, not as a Roman general, but as a king allied with a queen. The contrast between the two rulers grew sharper with time. Octavian presented himself as the defender of Roman tradition, modest in dress, restrained in appetite, devoted to the Republic's institutions. Antony, by contrast, was painted as Cleopatra's consort, a man seduced by feasts, luxuries, and foreign gods. Whether these portrayals were fair mattered less than their effectiveness. In a republic wary of civil wars, appearances could determine loyalties, and Octavian proved a master of appearances. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony began to stage their vision of joint rule more openly. One of the most striking episodes came in 34 BCE, after Antony's campaigns in Armenia. Though the war itself brought mixed results, Antony celebrated a triumph in Alexandria, a direct challenge to Roman tradition, for triumphs were meant to be held only in Rome. During the spectacle, Antony and Cleopatra appeared seated on golden thrones, their children arrayed beside them. In what became known as the Donations of Alexandria, Antony distributed eastern territories among Cleopatra and her offspring Armenia to Alexander Helios, Cyrenaica and Libya to Cleopatra Selene, and Syria and Cilicia to their youngest, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Cleopatra herself was declared Queen of Kings, while Caesarion was proclaimed the legitimate son and heir of Julius Caesar. The symbolism was unmistakable. Antony and Cleopatra were not presenting themselves as mere allies of Rome, but as sovereign rulers with authority independent of it. They envisioned a dynasty that spanned from the Nile to the Euphrates, with Alexandria as its glittering capital. To the people of Egypt, this was a triumph of national pride. To the Senate in Rome, it was an outrage. Octavian seized upon the moment. With skillful propaganda, he painted Antony as a traitor to Rome, a man who had handed Roman provinces to a foreign queen and planned to establish an oriental monarchy. Cleopatra, in turn, was cast as the seductress who had corrupted him, a new Helen luring Rome into ruin. Every act of generosity Antony made toward Egypt was recast as betrayal. The stage was being prepared for a confrontation that could end only in war. Yet within the walls of Alexandria, the mood was different. Cleopatra and Antony continued to host lavish ceremonies, present themselves as divine figures, and nurture their vision of a shared empire. They seemed to believe that their wealth, their armies, and their bond would be enough to withstand Octavian's hostility. In those moments of celebration, it was possible to imagine that the Mediterranean might yet be ruled not from Rome, but from Alexandria. But history was moving swiftly. Octavian was consolidating power in Italy, rallying the Senate to his cause, and portraying himself as the sole protector of Roman values. Antony and Cleopatra, despite their resources, were drifting toward isolation. The Donations of Alexandria had made their intentions clear, and their enemies in Rome would not rest until the threat was extinguished. The partnership that began with a barge on the Cydnus River had grown into a political vision that shook the ancient world. But visions, however grand, must face reality, and reality, in the form of Octavian's relentless ambition, was closing in. By the late 30s BCE, the Mediterranean world stood divided. In the west, Octavian tightened his grip on Rome, controlling Italy and presenting himself as the guardian of the Republic. In the east, Antony and Cleopatra reigned together from Alexandria, ruling over vast wealth and territory, surrounded by symbols of divine majesty. The uneasy balance between these two centers of power could not last. A clash was inevitable, and both sides prepared for it with the full weight of empire behind them. The spark that lit the final war came not from battlefields, but from words. Octavian understood that wars were won as much in the Senate as on the seas. He launched a propaganda campaign against Antony, painting him as a man who had betrayed Roman values. Antony, Octavian declared, no longer lived as a Roman general, but as the consort of a foreign queen. Cleopatra, in this narrative, was no mere monarch but a sorceress who had bewitched Antony, turning him into a puppet of Alexandria. Every banquet, every ceremony, every gift of territory became proof of treachery. Central to Octavian's case was Antony's recognition of Caesarion as the son of Julius Caesar. To the Senate, Octavian argued that Antony intended to supplant Rome's lawful order with an Eastern monarchy, with Caesarion as heir and Cleopatra as queen. The Donations of Alexandria, where Antony had publicly granted lands to Cleopatra and their children, were brandished as evidence. What had been intended in Alexandria as a display of divine authority was recast in Rome as a betrayal of the Republic. Octavian's genius lay not only in rhetoric, but in seizing the symbols of legitimacy. He had Antony's will, or claimed to have it, read aloud in the Senate. Whether genuine or not, the document was damning in its effecti. It allegedly confirmed Antony's plans to be buried beside Cleopatra in Alexandria, not in Rome. For Roman senators, the image of one of their own abandoning the eternal city for a foreign capital was intolerable. By exploiting outrage, Octavian maneuvered the Senate into declaring war. not against Antony directly, but against Cleopatra. In this way, Octavian transformed a Roman civil war into a foreign conflict. Antony and Cleopatra responded with equal grandeur. From Alexandria, they prepared their forces, fleets of warships, legions of soldiers, and immense stores of wealth. Cleopatra's treasury supplied much of the effort, for Egypt remained one of the richest lands in the Mediterranean. Together, they assembled what seemed an unstoppable force. Ancient sources speak of more than 500 warships, gleaming with bronze and gold, lining the harbors. Cleopatra commanded her own squadron, a fleet that symbolized her role not only as queen but as a partner in war. Yet numbers do not tell the whole story. Antony's forces were vast, but Octavian's were disciplined and well supplied. His admiral, Marcus Agrippa, was a strategist of rare genius. While Antony and Cleopatra gathered in Greece, Agrippa struck swiftly at their supply lines, capturing key coastal bases and cutting off grain routes. Over time, the Grand Armada at Actium became less a weapon of power than a burden, consuming resources and sapping morale. The decisive confrontation came on September 2, 31 BCE, off the coast of Actium in western Greece. Antony and Cleopatra arrayed their fleet in a wide line across the bay, while Octavian's smaller but more maneuverable ships advanced under Agrippa's command. The battle that followed was a test not only of strength but of endurance. For hours, the two sides clashed, ships ramming and boarding, the sea churned with splintered wood and fire. And then came the moment that has echoed through history. Cleopatra's squadron, stationed at the rear, suddenly broke from the line. With sails unfurled, her ships slipped through the battle and fled toward the open sea. Ancient writers debated the cause. Was it prearranged strategy, a retreat born of fear, or a desperate gamble? Whatever the reason, Antony, upon seeing Cleopatra depart, abandoned the fight to follow her. With a handful of ships, he sailed after her, leaving the bulk of his fleet to collapse in confusion. The retreat sealed their fate. Octavian's forces crushed what remained of Antony's navy. Though battles on land followed, the war was effectively decided. Actium was not merely a military defeat, but a psychological one. To Romans, it confirmed Octavian's narrative. Antony had become a man ruled by Cleopatra, choosing love over duty, abandoning his soldiers in the heat of battle. To Antony's supporters, it was a devastating blow to morale. The months that followed were a slow unraveling. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, their power shrinking as Octavian advanced inexorably through the eastern provinces. One by one, allies defected. Antony's legions, weary and disillusioned, surrendered or fled. Even loyal kings who had once supported him bent the knee to Octavian. In Alexandria, Cleopatra attempted to negotiate. She considered sending Caesarion eastward to secure his safety. Envoys reached out to Octavian, offering terms, even the promise that she might abdicate in favor of her children. But Octavian was unyielding. He understood that Cleopatra alive was too great a threat, too potent a symbol. Only her downfall could cement his victory. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian's forces surrounded Alexandria. Antony, though despairing, fought one last battle at the city's gates, leading a small band of loyal soldiers. Defeated, he returned to the palace, where news reached him, falsely, that Cleopatra had already taken her life. In anguish, he fell on his sword. Still alive, he was carried to Cleopatra's chambers, where he died in her arms. Cleopatra, left alone, faced Octavian with all the poise of a queen. She met him in negotiations, dressed not in mourning but in her royal finery, presenting herself as the daughter of kings. Yet she knew her fate was sealed. Octavian intended to parade her through Rome as a captive, a trophy of his triumph. For Cleopatra, who had lived her life as a goddess and queen, the prospect was unbearable. On August 12, 30 BCE, Cleopatra chose her own end. Tradition holds that she allowed an asp, a venomous snake, to bite her, though other accounts suggest poison concealed in a hairpin. However it happened, she died beside her attendants, preserving in death the dignity she could not keep in defeat. Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, was soon killed on Octavian's orders. though her children with Antony were spared and taken to Rome. With Cleopatra's death, the line of the Ptolemies came to an end. Egypt, long a kingdom of pharaohs, queens, and divine rulers, became a Roman province. Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, stood unchallenged as master of the Mediterranean. The Republic, in truth, was over. Empire had begun. Cleopatra's story did not end with her death. For centuries, she lived on in memory and myth, sometimes as a seductress who bewitched great men, sometimes as a brilliant ruler who dared to challenge Rome, sometimes as a tragic heroine who chose death over humiliation. Yet, beyond the legends, her life remains a testimony to the possibilities and perils of power. She had loved, ruled, and fought on a scale few women, or men, ever achieved. And though her throne fell, her name endured, whispered across time with both awe and sorrow. When Cleopatra breathed her last within the palace walls of Alexandria in August of 30 BCE, an age ended. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from the generals of Alexander the Great, had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Now, with the queen's death and the extinguishing of her heir Caesarion, Egypt's independence was gone. The Nile Valley, which had for millennia produced pharaohs, became a province of Rome. The transition was not sudden in feeling, though sudden in law. In Alexandria, the people awoke the morning after their queen's death to streets filled with the heavy silence of uncertainty. For generations, Egyptians had seen kings and queens presented as living gods. Statues showed them alongside Isis and Horus. Priests spoke their names in the temples. Cleopatra had been the last to bear that aura. With her gone, no divine monarch stood above the people. Instead, soldiers in Roman armor filled the city squares, their standards raised, their commanders delivering orders in Latin. The city that had once rivaled Rome as a capital of culture and power had been absorbed into its conqueror's orbit. Octavian, careful and deliberate, moved swiftly to secure Egypt. Unlike other conquered lands that might be turned over to a Roman Senate to govern, Egypt became the personal possession of Octavian himself. Its immense wealth, grain fields stretching across the Nile Delta, gold from Nubian mines, and customs duties from Red Sea trade, was too valuable to be left in other hands. By making Egypt his own domain, Octavian ensured that no rival general could use it as Antony once had. The Romans did not abolish everything that had come before. Much of the old Egyptian administration remained in place. Temples continued their rituals, scribes still recorded tax rolls in Greek and Demotic, and local village life carried on with a sense of continuity. But above it all stood Roman governors, appointed by Octavian, their authority backed by legions. Egypt was no longer a kingdom, it was a granary for the empire. The grain ships that left Alexandria each year for Rome became lifelines for the Roman people. In this way, Cleopatra's former throne became one of the pillars of Augustus's new imperial system. For the Alexandrians themselves, the change was both disruptive and strangely familiar. Alexandria had always been a city of outsiders, a Greek foundation upon Egyptian soil, filled with traders from every corner of the Mediterranean. Now it absorbed Romans into its crowded streets. Soldiers drank in its taverns, administrators studied in its libraries, and merchants sent goods northward. The city endured, its lighthouse still guiding ships, its libraries still housing knowledge, but its identity shifted. Where once it had been the seat of a queen, now it was the jewel of a province. And what of Cleopatra's children? Their fate was a matter of deep curiosity and quiet gossip among the Alexandrians. Caesarion, her eldest son and the child of Julius Caesar, had been put to death. The official story was that too many Caesars is not a good thing, a cold phrase attributed to Octavian. Caesarion, though still only 17, represented a threat that Octavian could not risk. The mere fact that he bore Caesar's name and features might have inspired loyalty among Rome's people, or among soldiers nostalgic for the great dictator. His death ensured there would be only one Caesar, Octavian himself. The other children, however, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, along with the youngest, Ptolemy Philadelphus, were spared. Octavian chose a different course for them. They were taken from Alexandria to Rome, paraded through the streets as part of his triumph. Imagine the sight: the children of Antony and Cleopatra, dressed in foreign finery, walking behind Octavian's chariot as symbols of his victory. To Romans, the spectacle confirmed that Egypt's wealth and power had been subdued. To the children, it must have been bewildering, a journey from the luxury of Alexandria's palace to the humiliating gaze of Rome's crowds. Yet Octavian did not kill them. Instead, he entrusted them to his sister Octavia, the woman once married to Antony, who had raised her own children with dignity. In her household, Cleopatra's surviving children grew up among Roman elites, far from the Nile. Their destiny would no longer shape empires, but in quieter ways, their bloodline continued. Cleopatra Selene, the daughter, would go on to marry King Jubatukoi of Mauritania, carrying her mother's legacy into another royal court. In her, a fragment of the Ptolemaic line survived, transplanted to North Africa. The Roman world, meanwhile, celebrated Octavian's triumph. In 29 BCE, he returned to Rome in glory, leading processions that displayed treasures from Egypt: golden thrones, jeweled statues, exotic animals, and perhaps even works of art from Alexandria's palaces. Cleopatra's image was not absent. Paintings and effigies reminded the crowds of the queen, who had dared to oppose Rome and lost. Her story was retold as a cautionary tale, a narrative carefully shaped to glorify Octavian. From that moment, Rome was never the same. Octavian soon took the title Augustus, the first emperor. The Republic, wounded for decades, finally gave way to monarchy in all but name. And at the heart of this transformation stood Cleopatra's defeat. Without Actium, without Alexandria's fall, Octavian might never have secured such total power. Thus, in a strange way, Cleopatra's life and death were woven into the birth of the Roman Empire. Yet in Egypt, memory lingered differently. Among priests and common people alike, Cleopatra remained the last pharaoh, a queen who had defended her land against foreign domination. In the villages along the Nile, offerings to Isis continued, and Cleopatra's image blended into that of the goddess. Even centuries later, Egyptians looked back on her reign as the closing chapter of their ancient independence. The end of Cleopatra did not erase Egypt's greatness. The Nile still flooded, its waters nourishing the fields as they had for thousands of years. Farmers still sowed grain, traders still loaded ships, priests still recited hymns in temple courts. Life carried on, though under the shadow of Roman standards. But with Cleopatra gone, the sense of a living link between the people and their divine rulers had been severed. Egypt was now part of a larger world, its destiny tied to distant Rome. And so, from the death of a queen was born the age of emperors. Cleopatra's fall marked both an ending and a beginning: the end of pharaohs and dynasties, the beginning of Rome's unchallenged rule over the Mediterranean. For centuries to come, her name would evoke fascination, but her kingdom, once sovereign, was now an eternal province. When Octavian, soon to be Augustus, claimed Egypt as his personal province, he inherited not only its wealth, but also its people. And while the politics of dynasties and empires shifted rapidly, the rhythms of ordinary life along the Nile moved more slowly, deeply rooted in cycles older than Rome itself. For the farmers who planted barley and wheat, for the boatmen who carried goods along the river, for the priests who tended to temple rituals, the dawn of Roman rule was at first less a sudden break than a gradual overlay of foreign authority upon familiar traditions. The heart of life in Egypt remained the Nile. Its annual flood was the most important event of the year, dictating prosperity or hardship for all. Just as under pharaohs and Ptolemies, priests measured the height of the flood at sacred nilometers, those stone staircases cut into the riverbanks. Too little water meant famine, too much meant destruction of homes and fields. The new Roman governors, though unfamiliar with Egyptian religion, quickly learned to pay close attention to these measurements. The grain harvest of Egypt was no longer just the sustenance of Egyptians. It had become a lifeline for Rome. Thus, Roman officials treated the Nile's cycles with great seriousness. sometimes recording the height of floods in their official annals, as if it were an imperial concern. For the villagers, who made up the bulk of the population, life under Roman rule often looked much like life under the Ptolemies. Farmers still rose at dawn to plough with oxen, their wooden ploughs barely changed from those used centuries earlier. Families still baked bread from emmer wheat, brewed beer from barley, and kept goats and pigs in their courtyards. Mud brick houses lined village streets, their walls whitewashed against the sun. The sounds of life were timeless, children playing in dusty lanes, women grinding grain at hand mills, priests chanting hymns to Isis and Osiris. Rome, though vast and powerful, was distant from these daily rhythms, yet differences gradually emerged. Chief among them was taxation. Under the Ptolemies, Egyptians had been subject to heavy taxes on land, harvests, and even basic goods. The Romans did not lessen this burden. In some ways, they made it heavier. Egypt was now an imperial treasury, and Augustus's administrators carefully extracted its wealth. Every farmer had to declare the size of his fields and the yield of his crops. Scribes kept meticulous rolls in Greek, listing names and obligations. Taxes were collected not only in grain, but also in coin, and failure to pay could bring harsh penalties. Still, Rome was pragmatic. It left much of the old bureaucracy in place, employing local scribes and officials to do the work of record keeping. This gave a sense of continuity, even as the ultimate authority had shifted. Many documents from this period survive: papyrus receipts, contracts, and petitions, which show how ordinary Egyptians navigated the system. They wrote in Greek, the administrative language of the province, and sometimes added Egyptian notations. Life was recorded in ink as well as lived in fields and streets. The temples of Egypt also continued their role, though under new conditions. Cleopatra had styled herself as a living goddess, the embodiment of Isis, but the Romans had little interest in continuing this tradition. Augustus, careful to appear respectful, did not abolish the temples. He even allowed priests to go on performing rituals and sacrifices. Yet the political power of the temples diminished. No longer could they look to a pharaoh for protection. Instead, they had to appeal to distant governors or the emperor himself. Still, to the ordinary worshipper, little seemed different. Processions carried statues of the gods through villages. Festivals marked the turning of the year, and offerings of bread, beer, and incense filled temple halls. In the great city of Alexandria, life had its own character. The city remained cosmopolitan, filled with Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and now Romans. Its harbour was still one of the busiest in the world, with ships sailing to Syria, Greece, and Italy. Traders sold spices from Arabia, glassware from Syria, papyrus scrolls, and linen. Roman soldiers now patrolled its streets, their Latin commands echoing alongside Greek chatter. Theatres staged plays, philosophers lectured in courtyards, and scholars studied in the libraries that had survived Cleopatra's reign. Alexandria did not lose its vibrancy, though it was no longer the seat of a queen. Instead, it became the showcase of a province, the jewel of Rome's east. For the Alexandrians, the presence of Roman officials was both a disruption and an opportunity. Some families, especially those of Greek origin, found new paths to power by serving Rome. Wealthy Alexandrians could gain privileges by aligning with the governor, supplying grain, or offering financial support. For others, resentment simmered. Rome imposed strict controls. Egyptians were not allowed to serve in the Roman Senate, nor could senators enter Egypt without the emperor's permission. Augustus feared that control of the province was too tempting a prize. Egypt was too rich, too strategic to risk in the hands of ambitious men. Thus, he kept it under his personal rule, with equestrian governors instead of senatorial ones. Daily life was also shaped by the mingling of cultures. Roman customs seeped into Egyptian life, even as Egyptians held tightly to their traditions. Roman coins replaced many local issues, bearing the image of Augustus and later emperors. In art, some tombs of the period show striking blends. Traditional Egyptian poses combined with Roman clothing and hairstyles. In religion, the cult of Isis spread beyond Egypt, carried by Roman soldiers and merchants across the Mediterranean. What had once been distinctly Egyptian became fashionable in Rome itself, where temples to Isis stood near the Capitoline Hill. For ordinary Egyptians, though, survival mattered more than culture. The burden of taxation, the demands of labor, and the need to appease local officials shaped daily choices. In petitions that survive on papyrus, villagers begged for relief from taxes, complained of corrupt officials, or sought justice in disputes. These voices, though faint, remind us that beneath the grandeur of empires lived people whose concerns were practical and immediate. At the same time, Rome invested in infrastructure. Roads were improved to move grain more efficiently. Canals were dredged to keep the Nile's waters flowing into irrigation ditches. These projects, while serving Rome's interests, also benefited local communities. Villages prospered when the canals flowed well, they suffered when maintenance was neglected. Thus, Roman rule, like that of the Ptolemies before, was measured by the fertility of the land. One of the most visible changes was in the military presence. Legions were stationed in Egypt, their camps dotting strategic points along the Nile. Soldiers from Italy, Gaul, and Syria mingled with locals, sometimes marrying Egyptian women, sometimes clashing with them in taverns. Their presence was a constant reminder that Egypt was not free, yet they also brought new influences, words, and habits. For most Egyptians, the passing of Cleopatra and the arrival of Augustus may have seemed distant. Queens and kings had always come and gone. What mattered was whether the Nile would rise, whether taxes could be paid, whether bread could be baked. And in these daily concerns, life went on much as it had for centuries. The weight of empire pressed down, but it did not erase the enduring patterns of Egyptian life. In this mixture of continuity and change lay the reality of Roman Egypt. It was both a land transformed, its wealth redirected, its rulers foreign, and a land deeply the same, its fields fertile, its people resilient. Cleopatra's death had ended an era, but the rhythms of the Nile endured. When Cleopatra and Mark Antony perished in 30 BCE, it was tempting for their enemies to believe that their memory would perish too. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, had triumphed. He had taken Egypt, claimed its treasure, and paraded his victory across the Roman world. Cleopatra was gone, her children scattered, her dynasty extinguished. Yet history does not always obey the plans of conquerors. Cleopatra's legacy did not fade. Instead, it lingered, twisted and evolved, taking forms her Roman enemies could never quite control. For Augustus, the first step was propaganda. In the years after Actium, he presented Cleopatra as the foreign seductress who had nearly undone Rome. In his Res Gestae, the inscription of his achievements, he did not even name her, referring instead to the foreign woman with whom Antony had joined. By erasing her name, Augustus attempted to reduce her to a shadow, a cautionary tale of what happens when Rome's leaders fall prey to Eastern decadence. Cleopatra was painted as the dangerous queen who had bewitched Antony, leading him to betray his duties as a Roman. She became less a ruler in her own right, and more a symbol of Rome's anxieties about women, about the East, and about the fragility of power. But memory is not so easily erased. In Egypt, Cleopatra's presence remained vivid for decades. Temples still bore her inscriptions. Statues of her, sometimes paired with images of Isis, were not destroyed. Local priests, in their rituals, could still whisper her name alongside the gods. For Egyptians, she had been a pharaoh, the last of the line that stretched back to Alexander, and beyond him to the traditions of their ancient kings. Even in defeat, she retained a place in their sense of continuity. Her children, though scattered, carried fragments of her legacy. Caesarion, the son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, had been executed on Augustus's orders, too dangerous a rival to live. But her other children, by Mark Antony, were spared. Cleopatra Selene, her daughter, was married off to King Juba II of Mauritania in North Africa. There she became a queen in her own right, blending Egyptian, Greek, and Roman traditions in her court. Coins from her reign show symbols of both Egyptian heritage and Roman allegiance. Through her, Cleopatra's bloodline endured, even if Egypt itself no longer belonged to her descendants. In Rome, Cleopatra's memory lived in literature. Poets such as Horace and Propertius wrote of her as the fatal monster who had dared to challenge Rome. Virgil, in his epic The Aeneid, described the Battle of Actium in terms of cosmic struggle, with Cleopatra leading Eastern forces against the destiny of Rome. These portrayals reduced her to a foil, a figure meant to highlight Augustus's greatness, yet in their very intensity, they preserved her image. She was remembered precisely because she had been so threatening. Over time, however, the harshness softened. Roman fascination with Egypt only grew under the empire. Egyptian art, motifs, and religious cults spread through Italy and beyond. The goddess Isis became one of the most popular deities in the Roman world, worshipped in temples from Pompeii to London. Cleopatra, once condemned as a foreign sorceress, came to be associated with the mystique of Egypt itself. For some Romans, she was no longer just Antony's downfall, but a figure of allure, intelligence, and exotic power. Centuries later, when the Roman Empire itself began to crumble, Cleopatra's story did not disappear. Medieval chroniclers, reading Roman texts, repeated the tale of her beauty and cunning. Sometimes she was vilified, cast as a sinful woman who had lured great men to their ruin. Sometimes she was admired, portrayed as a queen who defended her kingdom against overwhelming odds. The ambiguity of her image allowed her to be reshaped in different ages, reflecting the concerns of those who told her story. In the Renaissance, Cleopatra re-emerged with force. Artists painted her death scene, often showing her in rich garments, the asp coiled at her breast. To some, she was the model of tragic beauty, a woman who chose death over dishonor. To others, she was a warning about the dangers of passion and ambition. Shakespeare, writing in the early 17th century, gave her one of her most enduring voices in Antony and Cleopatra. His Cleopatra is witty, proud, mercurial, and deeply human, a woman who could charm the stage as she had once charmed Rome. Through Shakespeare, she became not merely a figure of history, but a character of literature, capable of endless reinterpretation. Meanwhile, in Egypt itself, Cleopatra's memory lingered more quietly, woven into the vast tapestry of its past. For Egyptians under Roman and later Byzantine rule, she was one ruler among many, part of a line that stretched back to pharaohs and forward into Christian and Islamic dynasties. Yet in folk traditions and local pride, the idea of the last queen of Egypt, who stood against Rome and lived as a goddess, never fully vanished. Even in modern times, Cleopatra remains a symbol both contested and celebrated. In the 19th century, as European powers occupied Egypt, she was romanticized in operas, paintings, and novels as the embodiment of Eastern luxury. In the 20th century, she became an icon of cinema, portrayed in lavish productions that emphasized her beauty and her loves. Yet scholars, turning back to the papyri, coins, and inscriptions, remind us that she was more than a seductress. She was a shrewd ruler, a strategist who spoke many languages, a monarch who governed in a turbulent world. Her legacy, then, is double. On the one hand, she is the figure created by Augustus's propaganda, the dangerous queen, the temptress who nearly toppled Rome. On the other, she is the ruler remembered in Egyptian and modern eyes as a survivor, a politician, and the last of her line. Both images coexist, reflecting not only her life, but the power of memory itself. It is telling that Cleopatra has never quite disappeared from imagination. Few figures from antiquity have been reinterpreted so many times, in so many different lights. Each age finds in her story something it needs: a warning, an inspiration, a symbol of beauty, a symbol of resistance. Her life ended in tragedy, her kingdom swallowed by Rome, yet her name endures more vividly than that of Augustus's many governors or even of his heirs. In the end, Cleopatra's greatest victory may not have been over Caesar or Antony or Octavian, but over time itself. Rome conquered her body, her city, and her dynasty, but her story, shifting, elusive, immortal, slipped free of their grasp. Cleopatra lived, and still lives, in the imaginations of the world. When Cleopatra died in 30 BCE, The story of her life did not end with her. In some ways, it had only just begun. Her body might have disappeared into an Egyptian tomb, whose location has never been recovered, but her image, her voice, and her memory lived on, shaped and reshaped by the pens of men who had never met her, but who understood her symbolic power. Rome, now master of the Mediterranean, had every reason to remember Cleopatra, not only as the last queen of Egypt, but also as a figure who could embody Rome's own anxieties, triumphs, and lessons. The earliest stories of Cleopatra's life came not from Egyptians, but from Roman and Greek writers, most of whom were writing decades, or even centuries, after she was gone. Among them, Plutarch is perhaps the most famous. Born nearly a century after Cleopatra's death, he had no chance of knowing her personally. Yet his lives, especially the pairings of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, gave future generations the most enduring portrait of Cleopatra, clever, persuasive, and dangerously enchanting. To understand why Plutarch and others described her the way they did, you have to picture Rome at the moment of her death. Octavian, who would soon become Augustus, had defeated her and Mark Antony at Actium. Their suicides had cleared the path for him to consolidate power, not only as master of Rome, but as the man who ended Egypt's independence. For Octavian, telling Cleopatra's story was not simply about explaining what happened. It was about explaining why his victory was righteous, necessary, and glorious. So, almost immediately, Cleopatra became more than a queen. She became a symbol. For Octavian and his allies, she was the embodiment of the East, luxurious, wealthy, indulgent, and corrupting. She had seduced not just one, but two great Roman leaders, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, bending them so the story went away from Roman virtue and into foreign weakness. This narrative was useful propaganda. It painted Octavian as the defender of Rome against foreign decadence. But it also shaped how generations afterward would remember Cleopatra. Plutarch, writing later, was more cautious than Octavian's propagandists. He admitted that Cleopatra's beauty, while often spoken of, was not the sole reason for her power. Her real strength, he suggested, lay in her intelligence, her charm, and her ability to make every conversation feel personal and irresistible. According to him, she was witty, cultured, and able to speak many languages without interpreters. She was not just a temptress but a ruler, and that is what made her so remarkable. Still, even Plutarch could not escape the Roman framework. He compared her influence over Antony to enchantment, suggesting that her charisma was almost a kind of spell. Cassius Dio, another historian, writing even later in the 3rd century CE, gave an even harsher portrait. For Dio, Cleopatra was more calculating, more manipulative, and her relationship with Antony was framed as the downfall of a once great Roman general. Dio's account emphasized excess, the feasts, the wealth, the pomp. Cleopatra was made into the exotic other, the queen who represented everything Rome should avoid. What you see in these accounts is not a clear biography, but a mirror. Each Roman writer used Cleopatra's story to reflect the concerns of his own time. For Plutarch, she was a moral lesson about the dangers of passion. For Dio, she was a symbol of Rome's struggle between East and West. For Octavian, she had been a necessary villain in the story of his rise to power. And yet, in every telling, Cleopatra emerges as a figure larger than life. Even when the intention was to diminish her, the writers could not avoid granting her extraordinary qualities. If she was simply an ordinary queen, Antony's downfall would not have seemed so tragic, nor Octavian's victory so grand. Her intelligence, her skill with language, her ability to command loyalty, these qualities come through the hostile sources, almost in spite of themselves. It is striking to consider that we do not have Egyptian accounts of Cleopatra that have survived in the same way. The temples and inscriptions of her reign were written in the traditional pharaonic style, praising her as a divine ruler, a daughter of Isis, a bringer of prosperity. But the personal stories, the human details, are almost entirely Roman. This means that the Cleopatra you meet in history is filtered through Roman eyes, through Roman biases, and through Rome's need to justify conquest. The legend of Cleopatra, then, began as political memory. She was remembered as a woman who blurred the lines between ruler and seductress, between political strategy and personal influence. She was a cautionary tale for Roman leaders about the dangers of foreign entanglements. She was a reminder of how even the greatest men, Caesar, Antony, could be undone by passion. But she was also a fascination, a figure too compelling to erase entirely. And here lies the curiosity. When we try to imagine Cleopatra herself, how much of what we think we know is really her, and how much is Rome speaking through her? Were her banquets really as lavish as described? Or was that just a Roman exaggeration to make her seem decadent? Was her voice truly so enchanting? Or was that a literary device meant to explain why Antony abandoned duty for her? These questions linger because the sources are incomplete, colored by politics, and shaped by time. So, as you listen to the Roman voices that described Cleopatra, you begin to hear not just about a queen, but about an empire speaking to itself. Rome, after all, needed stories of victory. But in making Cleopatra the perfect adversary, Rome also ensured that her memory would never fade. If her story had ended only with her death, perhaps she would have been forgotten as one more ruler of Egypt. Instead, she became eternal, because Rome could not stop talking about her. But how did this Roman version of Cleopatra evolve into the more mythical figure we know today? The Cleopatra of Renaissance art, of Shakespeare's plays, of modern imagination, that belongs to the next stage of her legend. Once Rome had crafted its version of Cleopatra as both villainess and enchantress, the story did not stay confined to dusty scrolls. Over the centuries, that Roman memory grew, changed, and was embroidered until Cleopatra became less of a historical queen and more of a myth. She lived on in the imagination of poets, dramatists, painters, and even gossip mongers. Each age shaped her into whatever image it found most fascinating, sometimes cruel, sometimes romantic, sometimes tragic, but always larger than life. One of the most famous myths about Cleopatra is that she conquered men with beauty alone. Roman writers hinted at this, but they also suggested that her voice, her intelligence, and her theatrical presence mattered more. Later centuries, however, seized on the beauty story with delight. By the Middle Ages and Renaissance, Cleopatra was painted and described as the world's most beautiful woman, the rival of Helen of Troy. The fact that Roman sources themselves doubted her physical beauty was quietly ignored. Beauty made for a simpler tale. Beauty explained the supposed weakness of Caesar and Antony. Beauty turned Cleopatra into a cautionary emblem, and later, into a romantic ideal. Yet the myths about her wealth may be even more enduring. Ancient accounts describe banquets so extravagant they seem almost impossible. Cleopatra, they said, could dissolve pearls in vinegar to show that she could consume a fortune in a single sip. Scholars debate whether this story was ever true, whether it was chemically possible, whether it actually happened, or whether it was pure invention. But the tale stuck. For centuries afterward, Cleopatra became synonymous with decadence, with the kind of wealth that could be wasted in a moment for the sake of display. This was not just idle storytelling. These tales played into a deep Roman and later European fascination with the East as a land of riches and indulgence. Egypt, with its temples, its treasures, and its long traditions, was imagined as a place where gold and pearls flowed easily, where rulers could indulge in pleasures Rome considered excessive. Cleopatra was the perfect personification of this idea. She was Egypt itself, made into a woman dazzling, mysterious, and dangerously luxurious. Over time, her story was embroidered further with touches of the exotic. She was linked ever more closely to the goddess Isis, not only as a religious patron but as an embodiment of divine femininity. In art, she began to be painted with symbols of fertility, wisdom, and seduction. Medieval and Renaissance artists, who had never seen her face, imagined her in flowing robes, reclining on couches, her hair braided with gold, her skin pale or dark depending on the artist's fancy. She became a canvas on which cultures projected their own ideals of beauty and danger. The myth of Cleopatra as the ultimate seductress was sharpened by the drama of her death. Plutarch's story of the asp, the snake smuggled into her chamber in a basket of figs, became one of the most enduring images of antiquity. Painters loved it. Poets adored it. Shakespeare made it immortal in Antony and Cleopatra. The asp was more than a detail, it was a symbol. It suggested that Cleopatra chose her end with a mixture of dignity and theatrical flair. She would not be paraded through Rome in chains. She would not be remembered as a captive. Instead, she staged her own death as a final act of defiance, leaving behind a mystery that could never be fully explained. In this way, Cleopatra's suicide became a kind of performance. Later centuries saw her less as a defeated queen, and more as a tragic heroine, choosing death over humiliation. The romantic imagination of the Renaissance, in particular, adored this idea. Cleopatra became a woman of passion, doomed by love, ennobled by tragedy. In these retellings, her political savvy was often forgotten. Her reign as pharaoh reduced to the backdrop for her romances. She was no longer the strategist who commanded armies and negotiated with Rome, but the lover of two great men, undone by feelings. And yet, even in this softened, romantic version, Cleopatra's myth always carried a double edge. For some, she was an inspiration. A woman who commanded men, who lived boldly, who defied Rome. For others, she was a warning, a reminder of what happens when women wield too much power, when passion overwhelms reason, when luxury corrupts strength. Few figures in history have been so elastic, able to serve as both symbol of power and of weakness, both goddess and temptress, both heroine and villain. The persistence of these myths tells us something important. People have always found it hard to imagine Cleopatra simply as she was. A queen ruling a fragile, wealthy kingdom, navigating the pressures of Rome's growing dominance. That is a complicated, subtle story. But Cleopatra as the embodiment of beauty, luxury, or love, that is a story that can be told over and over again, reshaped to fit each new culture's imagination. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Cleopatra had become firmly established as an icon of art and theatre. Painters in Italy, France, and beyond delighted in capturing her final moments, often reclining on a couch with a serpent at her breast, draped in jewels and silks. Shakespeare's Cleopatra, in turn, gave English literature one of its most memorable heroines, mercurial, witty, playful, and tragic. His play ensured that Cleopatra would never vanish from Western memory, even as the real details of her reign receded further into the shadows. And so, the myth of Cleopatra as we often know it today, the beautiful seductress, the decadent queen, the tragic lover, was not born in Egypt but in Rome, and then reborn in the imaginations of poets and painters who came long after. She became an icon not because of what she truly was, but because of what others needed her to be. But while Cleopatra was remade in myth, what happened to the real Egypt she once ruled? After her death, Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire. Its temples, its people, and its traditions carried on, even as its queen was remembered in legend. When Cleopatra ended her life in the summer of 30 BCE, Egypt did not simply lose a queen. It lost the last pharaoh in a line that had stretched back thousands of years. Her death marked the end of a political order that had endured through dynasties, invasions, and revolutions. With Cleopatra gone, Egypt became a province of Rome. For the first time since the unification of the two lands, Egypt was ruled not by a native dynasty, nor by a foreign pharaoh in Alexandria, but by governors sent from abroad. Augustus, formerly Octavian, wasted no time in reshaping Egypt. He declared it his personal domain. Unlike other provinces which were assigned to senators, no senator could enter Egypt without his permission. The Nile Valley, with its grain harvests, its ports, and its strategic wealth, was too important to leave in the hands of rivals. Egypt became the emperor's granary, its fertile soil filling the markets of Rome with wheat, and ensuring that the empire's capital would never go hungry. For the Egyptian people, daily life continued in many familiar ways. Farmers still tended their plots along the Nile. Priests still performed rituals in the temples. Merchants still sold goods in the markets of Alexandria. Yet beneath this continuity, a subtle shift occurred. The pharaoh, once the link between gods and people, was no more. Roman emperors occasionally adopted pharaonic titles in local inscriptions, but everyone knew the center of power had moved west. The pyramids stood as reminders of the past, but Egypt had become part of something new, a global empire. In this sense, Cleopatra's death was more than personal tragedy. It was a hinge of history. It closed the book on the pharaonic tradition and opened another on Egypt as a jewel of Rome. Alexandria remained a hub of learning, trade, and culture, but it was no longer the capital of an independent kingdom. Instead, it became a cosmopolitan Roman city, where Latin mingled with Greek, and Egyptian traditions adapted under new rulers. And yet, while Egypt carried on, Cleopatra herself refused to fade into obscurity. Rome's leaders made certain of that. Augustus ensured that she would be remembered in a particular way, not as a queen equal to him, but as a dangerous temptress who had tried and failed to undermine Rome's greatness. Poets and historians under his patronage spread this image widely. Virgil's Aeneid depicted her as a monstrous figure aligned with chaos, standing against Rome's destined order. In this way, Cleopatra's image became propaganda, a symbol of Rome's triumph over disorder and foreign decadence.